Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to the fourth day of the hearings into the examination of the Bridging Island Plan for Jersey. My name's Jeff Salter. I'm the Assistant Inspector to Mr. Keith Holland. I've been taking this session this morning, and he's going to be along this afternoon to talk about the historic environment. Some of you, we've got a lot of new people here, some new people here today, so apologies to those of you that have heard this before. I'll give a brief introduction about procedures and then what the programme is for today before we start the discussion. Mr. Holland and I have been charged to examine the plan in accordance with the your Planning Act, the Planning, Building and Jersey Law 2002, taking into account a number of criteria, but in essence, that the plan must be based on evidence, proper evidence, that it will produce an appropriate strategy for sustainable development, that it's capable of delivery, and that it contributes to the government's wider objectives. We'll be having a discussion later on, but I'd like to stress at the outset, as Mr. Holland has done, as I've done every time, we have read all the representations and a lot of the documentation to do with this. So the purpose of the hearing today is not for you to restate cases that I've already seen. It's for me to ask some questions to get some further information about this, and for you to question points made by the other side that you're not happy with. So please keep to the point and be brief. We're starting today with the Coast National Park, and primarily looking at the issues that I've identified in the programme, the 4 questions that I set out about that. I'm then going to take a short break before we go on to dealing with the marine spatial plan issue, and there's one issue about the green backdrop zone, which is also related to the natural environment. Quick health and safety announcement. I think we're not planning to have any alarms, but if there is one, please leave the building as quietly and quickly as you can and congregate on the grass above the patio out the back there. Please turn mobile phones off. I'll do that myself because they interfere with the microphone system. The microphone system is for the recording primarily. It doesn't project into the room itself very much, so you do need to speak up when making your responses or statements and giving your evidence. And just make sure you turn it on and speak directly into it. We have had some problems with that. You might or might not be aware all these proceedings are being live streamed and recorded. We've also got the ability for people to join by team. So, in fact, Deputy Renouf is going to attend by teams. He's didn't come today because he's got a very bad cold, but he's going to try and participate through that mechanism. So that's one way of making sure that everyone can participate. I don't think I have much else to say, really. It will be a discussion. There won't be any introductions, but actually, unusually today, I'm going to ask the Council to start because I've read your. We've had some objections to sort of the issues. Really, are should the park be extended, or the designation, however mechanism it's going to be extended out from the current definition as was done in the 2011 plan, I believe, taking up more land within it, or should there be another mechanism that deals with this, such as the Alaska, as it's called, area, which is essentially like an area of outstanding natural beauty or area of landscape importance. There are other issues as well, which maybe the states would like to talk about. But my understanding is that the management of the park is through a separate mechanism that's been set up and is out with the planning system. And there is also another proposal in the plan that the Minister is going to look at changing permitted development rights within the park, which is, again, well, it's in the plan as a proposal. I know there's a lot of comment about that, and I, can hear a brief discussion about that. But first of all, Mr. Pilley, would you? I've read your state's representation 43 about the Coast National Park, which responds to some points Deputy Renouf has made and deals with the quality of the landscape character and the purposes of the plan, etc. And then you've actually asked us to look at another option. Now, but you say you don't really want to change the plan itself. What's the Minister's current position on this? What are you asking us to agree the extended boundary as it is, and that development within that boundary is dealt with under policy NE3, or are you asking us to recommend anything else?
Okay, thank you, sir. I mean, I think if I could start in terms of talking about the purposes of the Coastal National Park designation from a planning perspective, because clearly that's what we're here to talk about today, is the review of the island plan, which is a development plan, so it regulates development activity. And it's probably worth just dialing back a little, looking at the provenance of the Coastal National Park designation in Jersey, which arose in the review of the 2011 island plan, and was essentially a tool to protect the outstanding landscape quality of the best bits of the island's coast and countryside. So that's its primary purpose, and that's where it originated from. As you rightly said, sir, in the 2011 island plan there was a proposal that set out that any management regime that might be adopted or promoted within the Coastal National Park is out with the planning system, where it doesn't involve development activity. So that was a proposal that was made in the 2011 island plan is an entirely separate matter from the planning process. But getting back to the principal purpose of the designation, essentially we have a planning policy regime outside of the built-up area in successive island plans where we seek to have a greater control over development, and particularly the highest level of control over development in those most sensitive landscapes. And the Coastal National Park designation served to ensure that the highest level of protection was given to those sensitive landscapes. As part of the review of this plan, we've commissioned some new work. It's perhaps worth stating that the original designation of the Coastal National Park in 2011 was based on some work largely undertaken in 1999 when we did a countryside character appraisal. That countryside character appraisal has underpinned successive island plans and has been renewed in the context of the review of this plan. And we commissioned a piece of work to revise that earlier assessment.
Is that from the Fiona Fife Associates? That's this?
It was undertaken by Fiona Fife, but it is the Integrated Landscape and Seascape Character Assessment. So that's right. So which essentially updated the approach to review of landscape and seascape quality and extended the spatial application of that piece of work. Previously, the assessment of countryside character had just gone to high water mark in the island. The ILSCA went right out to territorial waters and looked at both landscape and seascape. So it's a change in terms of the spatial extent of consideration of those qualities. Because
yeah, so I had a question about that, but I'll deal with that later. Yeah.
Okay, well perhaps, I mean I can highlight, sir,
but then you also, I mean, it's not just there's also some fairly extensive increase in the area inland as well.
That's right, sir. That's right. So
based on this document.
That's right. So the ILSCA provides the core evidence base in terms of the assessment of landscape and seascape quality, and then an additional piece of work, again undertaken by Fiona Fife, but also working in partnership with Karen Taylor, who's a planner with experience in the UK, with experience of working in national parks. They undertook a piece of work to look at the relevance and some of the challenges and issues that our current national park policy regime has been experiencing over the lifetime of the 2011 Island Plan. So, and arising from that piece of work, there was some particular challenges. There's some concern that our current coastal national park boundary is in many instances drawn quite tightly, probably with the exception of St Wan's Bay, where it embraces both, is hard on the coastline, but it also embraces the entirety of the bay, including the escarpment. But in the rest of the island, it is largely limited to the cliff tops and the immediate environment of the coast, with perhaps the exception of Grouville Marsh, where not Grouville Marsh, Grouville Common, where it embraces the Royal Jersey Golf Course in the east.
Yes, I should say, I didn't say in opening actually, I have tried to visit quite a lot of the national park in my previous familiarisation visits there, and actually had a couple of very nice afternoons walking the Coast National Park on the northern side. But I visited and as well as visiting all the sites that some of you weren't here for, but when we travelled all around the island looking at a very large number of sites actually, and the villages including St Martin's, but also down the east side and the places you've just mentioned. So I'm not as familiar with it as you all are, obviously, but I've tried to make myself reasonably familiar with the nature of the park and its different parts, which in this was sort of divided up into, is it 10 sections, I believe, wasn't it, I think, in this?
Yes, that's right,
yeah.
sir.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I say, sir, that piece of work sought to look at some of the challenges that we've had in terms of the existing operation of the planning policy regime in the 2011 Island Plan, and there's some key challenges there. One was around how tightly the Coastal National Park boundary is currently drawn, and situations where we may get development which is in close proximity to the Coastal National Park boundary but not within it. And there's been some concern that that's had an adverse impact on the quality of the island's landscape and seascape, particularly around the coastline. There was another objective was really to regularise the boundaries of the Coastal National Parks. At the moment, it's largely based on topographical features and is quite hard to follow on the ground. So this piece of work sought to make it easier to comprehend and to understand the Coastal National Park boundary. So those pieces of work have informed the preparation of the draft plan, and I think it's the Minister's aspiration that we ensure that the revised island plan provides a better and a stronger planning policy regime for the protection of the best bits of coast and countryside in the island, and the Minister's been very firm in that commitment. So essentially he's looking for a mechanism in this island plan that does that. And the proposed extension of the Coastal National Park was seen to be the best way of achieving that, in the sense that under the current island plan we have quite a simple planning policy regime in the countryside, where effectively we have two zones: the Coastal National Park that enjoys the highest level of protection, and then the green zone, which still enjoys a high level of protection, but it's an area that has not been as robustly protected through planning policy as the Coastal National Park. And so I think we wanted to maintain that simplicity of planning policy regime for the countryside, and so we effectively sought to take that existing policy regime forward and to look at how it might be applied in a way that address some of those challenges, where we ensure that those areas that have been subject to challenge during the current island plan period were better protected, and we also regularised the boundaries. So I think that's the hopefully that provides some of the basis for the provenance of the current proposal, sir. And I think in terms of where the minister stands,
doesn't address my question.
Well, where the minister stands, I think,
now?
is as set out in his statement, sir. In that clearly the minister's preference is that we take forward the draft Bridging Island Plan as proposed,
as it is,
with the proposed extension to the Coastal National Park. However, as you alluded to, sir, there have been a number of representations. No doubt we will talk about some of the substance of those a little later. The minister's of the view that some of those representations are not really to do with planning policy, they're to do with issues outside of planning policy related to land management and access, but no doubt we'll talk about some of those.
Well, we might not talk about them at much length, because if they're not part of the planning process and anything that is in the plan, then really there's my time and Mr. Holland's time in writing a report about that is wasted effectively, because it's not part of our remit to talk about things that are outside of the planning framework.
I simply raise them, sir, in the sense
I appreciate there are some concerns about that, but that's why I asked you to introduce them.
Sure.
If anyone's got any questions about that, I will deal with them, when we've discussed the planning merits of this. But in brief, I warn you.
Yeah, I simply raise them, sir, in the sense that they've been raised with the Minister, and I think the Minister sought to address them in his statement response.
Yeah,
and
which I've read is quite clear.
Yeah, and I think people are conflating the provenance of a national park in Jersey, perhaps with the different provenance of national parks that might exist elsewhere, such as the UK, for example, where it's quite telling that the introduction of national parks in the UK, brought about in 1949, was brought about by some legislation called the National Park and Access to the Countryside Act, which is, of course, an entirely different basis for bringing in some legal vehicle.
Well, yes, partly. It was, primarily there were two key issues, intentions, weren't there, to protect the landscape and to promote access and to promote the enjoyment for everybody of national parks.
That's right,
and
sir.
You're telling me, I think, that your national park is entirely really protection of the landscape.
Certainly in terms of the development plan
in
objectives,
sir. From a planning context.
That's exactly right, sir. So it confers no obligations in terms of land management, neither does it confer any obligations in terms of public access. And, as you will know, sir, in the UK, rights of access, even in even in national parks in the UK, are limited by public rights of way and permissive rights on cultivated land, and even on uncultivated land. Whilst there might be some open access, that's not universal.
Well, it's generally national trust, actually, isn't it? But
and clearly, I'm sure you are, sir. And clearly in Jersey we don't have much uncultivated land.
No.
And if you are on cultivated land, uncultivated land, it's like to be a limited area.
Yes, I think. Mainly in some in the northwest, isn't there?
There are some open areas of heath and commons
up there, which I did visit, actually.
So I think in returning to the Minister's position, as I say, the Minister's primary objective is to ensure that this island plan delivers an enhanced protection regime in terms of the regulation of development activity for the best bits of the island's coast and countryside. And that includes parts of the agricultural interior, sir, as assessed by the ILSCA work. So the Minister's preference is that's how we take it forward. Clearly, we've got an amendment from Deputy Renouf, which seeks to challenge that position, the effect of which would essentially leave us with the current Coastal National Park designation, and then that wider area without any additional planning control or any additional greater planning regulation, and that doesn't meet the Minister's objectives, which is why, in light of Deputy Renouf's amendment, the Minister has suggested a potential alternative that might be tested and examined. So that would essentially...
Yeah, so we just get, sort of outline for me what that is and check that my understanding of this is correct. That there'll be a new law, that you want to pass a new law to confirm the status of the national park.
That's not the Minister's position,
the
so
Minister's position?
that would be the effect of the Deputy's proposed amendment, sir.
Okay. So proposals for the Assembly to redefine, this is Deputy Renouf's proposal, right?
That's right, sir.
To redefine the boundary to exclude land in the interior agricultural plateau, and then designate an Alaska to cover the area in an extended national park in the plan. And I think explore changes to the GPDO or the General Development Order in consultation with stakeholders stays in his proposal. I hope that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps to clarify, sir, the Minister's position is that, as I've stated, that his preference is that we take forward the extended coastal national park, which would extend the planning policy regime to a wider area of high landscape and seascape value.
As redefined.
That's right, as
and
proposed.
The draft plan,
that's right. In the event that Deputy Renouf's amendment is, in light of Deputy Renouf's amendment, the Minister is concerned that that objective might be under threat. I think the effect of Deputy Renouf's amendment would be that we leave the Coastal National Park designation as it is, and the government then undertakes some additional work to look at establishing or looking at the potential to establish a legal framework for the basis of national park designation in the island. I presume similar to that which you may have in the UK, or at least to explore the relevance of what happens in the UK relative to Jersey. And I think the Minister's concern about that is that would leave these other areas that the Minister is concerned are of high landscape value, as demonstrated by the ILSCA work, open to some of the challenges that we currently face under the 2011 Island Plan. So the Minister wants to ensure that there's a planning policy regime that provides that highest level of protection. Now, his Alaska proposal is essentially one that would effectively introduce an additional level of, or additional type of zone into the countryside, if you like, sir. So effectively we would have the existing coastal national park, where the planning policy regime would afford the highest level of protection, in addition to which there's a provision that says that development in that area should be compatible with the purposes of the coastal national park, and that's as currently exists.
Under NE3 as currently drafted.
That's right. That's right. In the event that the Alaska proposal is taken forward, you would then have an area outside of the existing coastal national park boundary, but which replicates the proposed extension of the coastal national park, where
so that's the area between the national park and the proposed new boundary.
Correct, sir. Where the policy regime would be the same, apart from the issue about compatibility with the purposes of the coastal national park.
So is that going to be subject to NE3 as well then?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it would be subject to an amended NE3, as set out in the Minister's statement response. So, essentially that would give that area the same level of planning policy protection in relation to development activity, with the exception that the development would not need to pass the test of being compatible with the purposes of the coastal national park.
Yeah, okay.
But as I say, so that's hopefully set out in the Minister's statement response.
Yes, but I'm making a note of that,
yeah, sure.
Because that's a key difference. Right, it's quite a lot to digest there.
Yeah, was there anything else you wanted me to
No, I don't think so. Deputy Renouf, can you, I don't know if you can hear this, do you want to come in and make any comments on that in relation to your amendment? How does this work, please? Good morning. We can see you, but we can't hear you, Deputy Renouf. Just a minute, please.
I think you might be on mute, sir.
Well, you may be. Are you on? Do you want to try and say something? Are you on mute? No, we can't. We still can't hear you. Okay, this is a first for me, ladies and gentlemen. I've never actually done this before in a public hearing, but technical glitch. Can we? Okay, we'll hold fire on that. And does anyone else want to? Let's start off with. I mean, a lot of people might have had some interesting comments.
Would you like to hear him straight from my laptop?
No.
No.
Sorry?
Possibly pick it up through your mic. As a weapon.
We could try it then. Can you hear then? That's not ideal, is it?
Speak. Oh, he can't fully hear me. Could you tell him in the microphone, please?
We're asking you to speak again, please, Deputy Renouf.
No, it's not even coming through my
Okay.
Something's happening.
Sorry about this. Just wait a minute. We'll try and sort out the technical problem, and I'll allow you to contribute in a few minutes. So we'll try and make use of the time and go on. Okay. Right. Well, is anyone in support of Deputy Renouf's amendment? Does anyone agree that that's the way forward? And do you, having heard what Mr. Pilley said about that, do you have any comments about it? I know some of you did. Sorry, I didn't say, but if you wish to speak, please put your board up so I know. And don't forget to turn the microphone on and speak directly into it, please. Okay. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, and introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm Councillor Richard Buchanan's Wands. It's unfortunate Deputy Renouf can't speak because he's the one who's put the proposition in. I think before we start, I think
speak up, please.
We ought to make the point that those of us who are opposed to this are only opposed to this on the basis of the amount of our parishes that disappear into the Coastal National Park, with frankly very little consultation. I know the government will argue that's not the case, but I think those who have parishioners on the ground will argue that it is the case. There's been very little consultation about this with members of our parish. We broadly support the principles of the National Park. In fact, I was delighted when the first proposal came in and protected our valuable coastline. This is not our valuable coastline. This is vast inland sways of swans that are disappearing into effectively a planning restriction. And frankly, this is, in my view, why we have green zone, which is planning restriction. This is simply making parishioners' lives unbelievably difficult if they want to do something to properties that are in the centre of a parish, not on a highly valuable coastline area. And we are concerned that it will place an undue burden of proof on their part to develop their properties, for which they've had very little consultation about. This is why we put the proposition in, so that there is an opportunity for consultation with people it affects, and that after that consultation, then we may or we may not support it.
Well, I think do you want to respond on the consultation point? I mean, I have to say, from my point of view, the states have followed the recommended consultation and publication procedures as set out in the regulations. in terms of publishing proposals in the plan, and even actually in terms of the further representations proposals, which are a publication process which has just finished. Do you want to make any comment about why? Obviously, clearly, a lot of residents feel that they weren't fully consulted about this.
Yeah, just a couple of points to make in response to that, sir. I think clearly, as you've stated, we followed the prescribed legal process that we're required to do so, and by virtue of the fact that we're sitting here today talking about the proposal is evidence of the fact that the process is a transparent and open process, and it clearly rests in the hands of the Assembly to determine the final outcome. I think some of the comment we've received is that there was some concern that the processes in terms of preparing some of the evidence base may not have been as open as people would have liked, particularly in terms of the Coastal National Park Boundary Review piece of work. There was a stakeholder workshop that we held in, I think it was September.
Yes, that's in your statement.
That's right, sir. So I think people may have been concerned that they felt excluded from the preparation of the evidence base, but clearly, as I say, so that's the evidence base, it's not the policy, and the draft policy is clearly set out in the plan. The plan has been through an open process of consultation where people had ample opportunity to make comment. We've undertaken public roadshows, we've held webinars. We're here today to discuss their representations with you as independent arbiters, and clearly the matter will be subject to political decision making. So I'm not quite sure how more open that could be, sir. In terms of the other issue to raise,
how people affected. Just to make it clear, I mean, I've tried to, as I've said, I wasn't just having a nice walk in the countryside. It happened to be a lovely day, but I was actually also looking at the boundaries and trying to, get some feel for how widely this was going to be extended. Particularly in those areas around St Martin's and St Swan. I did go there. I mean, ultimately, I've got the evidence of the review and your comments. So, I mean, I think it's really for me and Mr Holland to sort of try and decide whether we think that boundary's appropriately drawn on the ground. I will take into account, obviously, all of your comments, but it's difficult in these sessions, as we've said with the housing, to have lots of discussion about landscape impact. Ultimately, it's for us to sort of take a view based on what you've all said. But the impact on residents is another issue.
Might I comment on that, sir? I mean, clearly what we're seeking to do here is to establish a planning policy regime for the coast and the countryside, and as the constables mentioned, we have a planning policy regime that already applies in the coast of the countryside. The Minister wants to ensure that is enhanced for the most sensitive and valuable pieces of the island's landscape, and clearly those islanders who are fortunate enough to live in that environment would hopefully see some benefit from that. In terms of their ability...
On that point, do we have any idea of how many dwellings or residences have been included in the extended national park as opposed to the other one?
Off the top of my head, sir, I can't recall, but I think the Deputy's amendment may have sought to provide some information on that. But the additional point I was going to raise, sir, is the proposed change to the planning regime for the Coastal National Park would be affected through the General Development Order.
Yeah.
And and it's probably worth noting that the current island plan includes a proposal to amend the General Development Order to provide enhanced levels of protection to the existing Coastal National Park.
That was going to be another one of my questions. Why has that not been progressed? Has the consultation not taken place?
It hasn't, sir. So that work has simply not progressed just as a result of resource available to pursue that. But I think if there were to be any change to the planning regime where the thresholds are changed as to determine what requires planning permission, then that would require change to the General Development Order. Any changes to the General Development Order, whilst it's a secondary piece of legislation that the Minister can determine, the Minister would undertake consultation before he made any such change, sir. So the regulatory regime that would apply to the Coastal National Park, if that were to change, would be subject to open public consultation, as we would do in any event with any legislative change of that basis, sir.
Yeah, so as far as this plan's concerned, the regulatory change or the change affecting any residential properties is the difference between policy NE3 and the green zone policy, correct?
That's correct, sir. And well, the other point I'd make is also clearly there are other changes that we've made in other parts of the plan. So housing outside of the built-up area, policy H8, and some of the GD policies will also clearly set the planning policy regime for development in the coast and the countryside, sir.
Okay, thank you. We've got a lot of boards out. Is Deputy Renouf still silent?
We believe so, yes.
Okay, just a minute. We're still trying, Deputy Renouf, I promise you. But there's some of your colleagues, I think, want to say maybe things on your behalf. Well, you haven't got your board up, so I'm going to go to. I'll start at this at Mr. Vibert. Is it?
Yes. Yep.
Oh, up in that way. Sorry.
Yeah. I will come. Yeah, I'll come back to you, Mr. Lewis. Don't worry.
Yeah, I'm Constable Richard Vibert, Constable of St Peter, and I'm the neighbouring parish to Constable Buchanan. We find ourselves in a very similar situation to St One's, so I won't repeat what my colleague has already stated, other than I also have had representations about the lack of consultation. What I would say is that I was entirely supportive of the original national park, and I agree that actually the topography was relevant in determining the boundaries and was the correct thing to do. What we currently have now, and I saw the word convenience used in one of the reports, is that roads have been chosen as the boundary. And as a result of simply using the roads, there are substantial areas, I would say, that should not have been included. I'll give an example of my own property. It's 2.5 kilometres from the coast. It cannot be seen from the coast. I cannot see the coast. Not a single property in Rue des Niem, where I live, can see the coast, and nor can
just say your road again, please.
Rue des Niem, that's Niemes. So those properties can't be seen from the coast, and they cannot see the coast. Now, by choosing roads, that I believe that was totally incorrect. And the fact that the word convenience was used is very worrying, because not to have looked at the landscape, the geography, and considered are all these areas relevant has to be one of my main objections. I'm also worried about the extension which has been suggested of permitted development. I think virtually all the areas in the extension in St Peter are already in the green zone, which offers a high level of protection. And I cannot understand the reason for wanting to put yet another layer of planning regulations over the top of that. The green zone has worked very well. It's protected areas. There's no reason to extend it. And if we're now going to see a situation where somebody in large areas of St Peter's would be unable to put up a garden shed 6x4, that isn't acceptable. We also have to look at presumably, with a new layer of regulation, we also have to look at the headcount of the department. And an increase in headcount on a department that's already stretched and in some areas cannot cope with the existing workloads, how are they going to cope with extending the national park beyond where it is now and also putting restrictions on permitted development?
And those are my primary concerns over and above what my colleague has already stated.
Okay. Mrs. Wilson's just given me a note about people in the back row. I'm aware of you, but I'll try to. Okay, so I mean, this is where it starts getting a bit difficult. But so I'd like comments, please. Yeah, obviously I want to hear your comments, but don't repeat the same thing. I'll go down to Mr. Tuzel, is it?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Ian Tuzel, I'm the elected chairman of the Comité Rural in St John. We are the body which was charged with responding to the draft island plan and the draft bridging island plan.
Is that, forgive me for not knowing the intricacies of your Jersey administrative arrangements. Are you like the parish council then, effectively? Or
no,
not?
we are an independent committee
that
the parish has set up to deal with this process.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So we conducted a survey of parishioners to elicit their views on the proposals in the original plan.
I remember reading some representations, yes. Okay.
So I want to make specific points about the consultation process and the timeline of it. Okay.
Well, I mean, there's nothing I can do about that, is there?
No, absolutely. But it goes to the heart of, has the key stakeholder group, which is the householders and landowners within the expanded boundary area, have they been consulted adequately and efficiently?
Well, okay, I can make a note of that. I mean, Mr. Pilley's answered.
Well, we don't.
We're all here.
No. Well, we don't believe they have, because if you look at the timeline, the Fiona File report was published in February of 2021.
Yeah.
We were advised of the boundaries, and it was a very poor JPEG file that we were sent with no road names on it. We received that with the report, but eventually in April we got hold of the original JPEG. We had a Zoom call with the minister and said at that point that this was inadequate. It had no road names or landmarks on it. How was a layman supposed to determine whether they were or were not within the expanded boundary? And then eventually, as a result of that feedback, we believe the minister had an ArcGIS plan put online. We believe that went online in April, at the end of April.
That's this thing.
Yes, that thing. However, we didn't learn about that until June, second-hand, and we can find that no publicity has been given to it whatsoever, so the public are not aware of it.
Well, but forgive me, but the plan's was published for consultation in April with this.
Yes,
it must have been available for people to look at.
Well, the ArcGIS.
This is the essential document. This is the proposals map where the boundary is drawn.
Well, we were not aware that existed until later.
Well, it's been part of the process and the plan all along. When did you publish the proposals map? Was that in April?
So the proposals map is clearly an integral part of the plan, and it was published in April. I think it was the 19th of April we started the consultation. I think, as we've suggested, sir, there's a conflation between the engagement in terms of the preparation of the evidence base with the actual consultation on the policies and proposals in the plan. And as you've stated, sir, the proposal to extend the Coastal National Park is set out on the proposals map to which anyone in the island has been able to make representation, sir.
Okay. Well, all I'm saying is the laymen, the general public, were sweetly unaware of the entire map and therefore had no way to know whether their property was in or without the extended boundary.
Okay, well, the regulatory process has been followed, but I mean, do you have any? Can we get on to comments about the substantive nature of the proposals and the extension of the area? Does your committee have any views on that?
Only to echo the comments of the other constables in that roads have been used as convenient boundaries, and they don't actually. There were other roads in St John's case which could have been used, which were closer to the coast, so you have a very large inland expansion for no obvious reason.
Yes, I mean, I think it's not just, I think the words from the report weren't just convenience, but I've made a point about the road boundaries. I mean, I've been driven along it, actually, the main one at St. Juan, which forms a new boundary, doesn't it? Where you've got the valleys coming in up to it from the coast, which were part of the plan originally, I think. Okay, moving around the front row, I haven't forgotten you really. Mr. Godfrey, is it? I can't quite read that. Yep. Yes.
Thank you, sir. God, sorry, I'm knocking everything. So I appreciate that you're trying to steer away from the preparation of the evidence base, but
No, I'm not trying to do that.
Okay, well, that's...
we feel steering away from consultation processes because there's nothing I can do about those. They've been done, and as far as I'm aware, the regulatory requirements have been met, but the substantive points that are in the consultation documents and the evidence base, as I said in opening, is clearly one of my concerns. Is this based on proper evidence, sound evidence?
Indeed, and if the evidence base is flawed, I would suggest that the policy is flawed as well.
I'm interested to hear a comment on why you think that might be.
And the consultation process may have been followed to the letter, but there are times where I feel that our government can sometimes confuse quality with quantity. The workshop that was held in September was, and I have the invitation here, a very short invitation to the workshop, which in September 2020, I can assure you my focus was on keeping people employed, as part of our industry was being shut down. And that was my focus, to make payroll on the 25th of September. The invitation says, come to a meeting to learn more about this work and contribute to the development of its findings. And yet, from people who did attend, I understand that what was presented was pretty much a fait accompli. And that's why so many people involved in the process feel like they haven't been consulted properly.
Okay. But what about what's in it?
What about what's in it?
The evidence itself.
Well,
do you have any comments on that?
I think, I don't want to, obviously I'm not going to repeat new comments. We put a lot into our submission about that, which again, it mostly echoes what's been said before about the...
sorry, you're the Horticultural Society, aren't you?
The extent of the growth of the boundary. And perhaps we'll come on to later the conflation, as it's put, between management of the national park and the status of the national park. But I do find it strange that a policy can be put into a plan and the minister say that the administration of that policy is out with the plan. I don't think that would apply to historic buildings or to change of use of employment land.
Well, I don't think that's what's being said, is it? I mean, Mr. Pilley, you need to... I mean, the administration of the policy is through planning applications, through the planning system. The management of the park isn't part of the plan and the planning system.
But
if there are other things,
I think that's the application of responsibility.
That's nothing. I have no remit to comment or do anything about that whatsoever, actually.
But it does feel like an abdication of responsibility, where a policy is put into a plan and the minister says that the management of that is out with and separate from the planning policy regime. If that is the case, why is it in the plan?
No, I don't. I think there's a misunderstanding here with respect. I mean, I didn't explain that very well, maybe. Would you like to comment on that?
I'll try, sir. I think, clearly the minister's...
two things here.
The minister's remit is determined by the planning and building law, and the minister's remit is related to the regulation of development activity as defined in the planning and building.
Yeah.
So the Minister for the Environment cannot legally deal with other issues for which he does not have legal powers to do so. So I think it's entirely legitimate for the Minister in bringing forward a planning policy regime to regulate development activity, and the Minister's chosen to use something called the Coastal National Park Policy to do that. However, as I stated earlier on, sir, in 2011, when the original concept was brought forward, it was envisaged that there may be a partnership set up which included all landowners and specifically farming interests to look at potential management objectives for the Coastal National Park, but that was entirely out with the planning system.
Yeah, whose responsibility would those have been then? Would it have been your minister or another minister?
Well, there have been various changes of ministerial responsibility, sir, and the area of government that is now responsible for that aspect of the of government is the Minister for Economic Development, Tourism, Sport and Culture, and he has a relationship with the Jersey Coastal National Park, sir.
Yes, I mean, so what, are you saying that your reference in here to management into it's in the text of the plan, not the policy, is just a sort of historic reference and really doesn't really progress out, doesn't really help things very much, does it?
Well,
in terms of the plan objectives and the planning policies.
I think the planning policies and the objectives of the planning policy are very clear, sir. And clearly they fall within the legal responsibilities of the Minister, and he's seeking to discharge those legal responsibilities through the preparation of a development plan.
Does that answer your question?
Not entirely, because what we end up with is a muddle built on a mess. So, in the 2011 plan, I defer to Mr. Pilley's obvious experience of the wording of it, but it does say it was explicit at the outset, and this is the Minister's response to the draft Bridging Island plan, it was explicit at the outset that the progression of the purposes of the park were out with and entirely separate from the planning policy regime. Well, I still maintain if you have a policy and a plan, how can you abdicate the responsibility for management of it to another minister, which actually, within one government regime, presumably it is a government plan with government interest in the management of it.
It's a different sort of management. I suppose when you say management to me, I think of development control management in terms of planning applications. That's how the policy would be managed to me. The management of, I don't know, land use, or I mean whether maybe the other minister might want to promote, say, a tree planting scheme or some, environmental agricultural support scheme or whatever, would be separate from the planning regime, because it probably wouldn't involve development.
It might involve change of use, sir, which would come under the planning regime.
Well, yes, but if it did, then that would also have to be considered under the planning regime.
Hence, I think, perhaps you appreciate
there might be some
confusion.
There's some conflation, but I can't really take this a lot further, I don't think. There might be some conflation there, but I think I'm quite clear about what the plan policy says and what the management of that policy is as far as this. So, I mean, whether we recommend that the policy goes forward in the way proposed or not, or whether we recommend changes to the boundary as proposed, that's within our remit, and we're expected to do that. So that's why I've been out looking at it and come here to hear what you all want to say about it. Okay, can I think we've got some people at the back. Yes.
I'm being asked if we can have a short break because the Minister does want to speak and they need to sort this out because it is his amendment.
Yes, okay, I will take a short break in about a quarter of an hour. Okay? Sorry, who wants to speak? Deputy Renouf, Mrs. Wilson? Yes, fine. Oh yeah, what's the position with that?
Where? I want to have a break so they can sort it out because he does want to speak because it's his amendment.
Okay, I'll take 3 quick comments from the back. Mr. Stein, and then the 3 people. Oh, 4. All right. Try and make this brief, please, about the merits of the planning side of it. No.
Good morning, sir. Yes, I will do that, and it's just to explain that I attended the workshop in September, and the main premise justifying the change in boundaries was that field boundaries were not strong enough, and that they required road boundaries to establish the new boundary to the Coastal National Park. And to my way of thinking, that was basically a land grab. The other point I would say is that the attendees at that workshop were pretty much amenity societies who would have tended to vote in favour of an extension of the Coastal National Park.
Okay, moving along. Who's next, please?
Richard Lesueur on behalf of the Association of Jersey Architects. So, 2 points. Firstly, the Jersey Integrated Landscape and Seascape Character Assessment map, which is within the DBIP, shows interior agricultural plateau. Now, much of the interior agricultural plateau land has been subsumed wrongly, we would point out, in the Coastal National Park.
Yeah,
So
okay, that's a point being made by quite a lot of people.
Yeah, so there is evidence within the draft plan that contradicts the land grab, as Mr. Stein has said. Secondly,
I haven't written that down actually, but I know Mr. Stein.
Secondly, if I can take you back 40 years to when the
I was town planning then, actually.
Right.
I regret to say in some way.
To when the late great planning officer Bob Peyton produced the first Lemiel document, which looked at protecting the landscape. He stood on the sea wall with a map of the island and roughly drew a line along the top of the escarpment or the top of the cliff line, showing where he thought the protection should lie. Now, what has happened since then has been extended, and I think the current boundary is acceptable. I too was at the workshop last year and was amazed to hear the people running it say that they were very experienced with UK national parks, and that in their experience canals or railway lines were the best way to delineate the boundaries of a national park. So I pointed out that we don't have many of those in Jersey, and I would just finish by saying that field boundaries and topography is absolutely the best way to delineate it. Okay.
Yeah, Mrs. Stephen?
So my comments aren't brief, and I'm aware that you would prefer brief comments. I think Mr. Simmons would like to speak and would ask, would you prefer that I wait until after you've heard Mr. Renouf?
I don't mind. Well, either. I mean, I'm going to sort of have another 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll try and break at 11. And then, I mean, I'm not obviously. I'm not trying to cut off discussion at all. I mean, but it's obviously important that Mr. Deputy Renouf can. He can hear all this. I'm hoping.
Okay.
Is that right? Yeah. So that's fine. So we'll hear 2 more comments. Then I'll take a break in the hope that he can get back. Well, you'll have a chance to speak in due course. Obviously, I'm just working my way around. There's a lot of people to comment. So, I'm sorry, sir. Yes, who are you, please?
I'm Richard Simmons. I'm here representing Roselle Estates.
Yeah.
So, when you opened, you said that you were seeking to establish whether the proposals were based on proper evidence. And I would suggest that against that criteria, the boundary review report should not be taken into account on the basis of it lacks rigour. There's the lack of consultation has already been referred to. Roselle Manor, which is central to its proposals in St Martin, was not consulted and was first aware of it being considered as part of a national park when an article appeared in the JEP on the 15th of March, when the main thrust of that article was to claim achievement that 30% of the island would now be national park. It seems to me that the whole report was driven by an objective of meeting some international criteria and not a consideration of local matters. One other point I'd just like to make at this point is that the Minister seems to think that the public would understand the nuances between the definition of a national park in the UK and the definition of a national park in Jersey. Yet that doesn't seem to be understood by the Jersey National Park Limited itself, which on its website centres on access to the public. So I think although the Minister is saying this is not part of this proposal and shouldn't even be considered in this context, that is totally inconsistent with the position Jersey National Park is taking, which, as I understand, is funded by the states.
Yes, but is that, well, maybe that's this other Department for Economic Development, etc. I would imagine. Okay, I mean, I'm very I'm very loath not to take things into account. I'm very happy to take into account views that the evidence is of not such strong weight as other people think it is. So, but it's been there, it's been produced, and I am going to take it into account, but I've also taken into account your views about it. Mrs. Steedman, I'm going to come to you and then we're going to take a break.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to speak on behalf of many of my clients who feel very strongly that they haven't engaged with the process. And one of the reasons for that is that this plan has been produced during really challenging times, which we all know about, COVID. So the consultation that happened at the end of this summer, many feel that that is not something that they were aware of or had part of the opportunity to feed into. There is, as we've heard, some confusion about the purpose, and there's confusion about land use decision-making and the policies and what the purpose of the national park is for. Now, I personally support protection of the countryside and its environment. We are a business that does our very best to support clients and the island in protecting it. But we do need to understand, I think, what the needs of the communities are within that landscape and within those areas of the island. It is relevant that we have a third-party appeal system where neighbours have rights to appeal to planning applications. And it feels as though policies and the way they're framed and structured they give precedence and priority to residential amenity rather than to the needs of people who work in the coastal national park area and the green zone as is. And I think what you're hearing, sir, is real concern that increasing the size of the coastal national park will make it even more difficult to go about the everyday work and life of the community and the people who maintain hedges, maintain walls and maintain the landscape. So when Mr. Pilley says there's no implications for land management, I think we do need to be really clear about what the effect of policies are versus a coastal national park entity and what extra layer of controls there might be. And you're hearing the confusion, sir.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think there's something Mr. Pilley needs to come back on. I know you've got a lot of points. I've read you're acting for one of the parishes as well.
We've been supporting some of the parishes, but I'm speaking here independently, sir, as well.
Oh, okay, well.
And on behalf of the parishes.
I mean, you want me to look at the boundaries as well, you might have some points about that. Is there anything you want to say in response? Sorry. I beg your pardon. Is there anything you want to say in response to that, Mr. Pilley, before I take a short break?
There are a number of points to respond to, sir, from some of the previous submissions that have been made. I can do that quickly if that's acceptable to you?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, starting with Mr. Tuzel in the Committee Rural, he mentioned that the proposals map had been published and the area embraced. didn't perhaps reflect the Committee Rural's view about where the boundary should be drawn, but as far as I'm aware, sir, no representation was made as to what roads might be used in relation to, or what boundary features might be used to redefine the Coastal National Park. Picking up the Conotable St Peter's point about the criteria used to assess the boundaries for the Coastal National Park, the Constable said he couldn't see the coast from his property, even though it's embraced by the Coastal National Park. Views of the coast are not one of the criteria, so they're set out at 6.2 in the report, which looks at the various aspects of consideration. The other issue I wanted to raise was one that Mr. Godfrey highlighted. He suggested that the workshop that was held was a fait accompli. There were some working maps that we used as part of that session, sir, and indeed, as set out at Appendix A of the Coastal National Park Boundary Report, some of the changes that were made as a result of that exercise are set out at the back of that report. In terms of the attendees at the workshop, again, sir, they were set out at the back of the report, and they comprised a mixture of both amenity and development interests, and it's interesting to hear that we've heard from a planning consultant and an architect in terms of their attendance at the event. And going back to the issue of consultation, sir,
I don't think you need to be
well,
honest.
I was just going to make the point, sir, that we followed the prescribed process, and if anything, because of COVID, we've actually followed a consultation process that's involved both physical consultation in addition to virtual consultation as well. So, if anything, the level of engagement has been heightened because of the COVID situation. The point that the representative from Roselle Manor made in terms of the 30% being a target, that's not the case, sir. That's simply a recognition of the fact that the area proposed to be embraced by the Coastal National Park would represent that area of the island. And he also suggested there were some perhaps difficulties of understanding nuances between national parks in different parts of the UK. Clearly, national parks are an international designation, and they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So the nuances between various national parks regimes are it's not an issue that's unique to a difference between what we're proposing here in Jersey and what happens elsewhere. In terms of the point made by Mrs. Steedman in terms of the plan not having regard to other interests, that's not accepted, sir. Clearly there's a policy regime that sets out proposals for economic development throughout the island, and it's very clear in the preamble to policy NE3 that Jersey is a small place. Our island is a living and working environment, and that includes the area embraced by the Coastal National Park. And there is policy provision elsewhere in the plan that supports economic development activity throughout the coast and the countryside, with a clear policy regime that seeks to enable that economic development to take place in the coast and the countryside where that's justified. And perhaps the last point to raise, sir, is this issue about public interest in the protection of the coast and the countryside. One thing I didn't mention, sir, is when the original Coastal National Park designation was brought in, it was brought in at a time when there was a lot of concern, public concern, about development around the island's coast and countryside, and 7,000 people stood in a line on St Wan's Bay, sir, to support greater protection for the island's coast and the countryside. And it's a consistent theme whenever we do any consultation with islanders about what they value about Jersey. The quality of its coast and its countryside always features as the primary consideration, sir.
Okay, thank you. Right. Obviously, we're not finished hearing comments about this, but I'll take how long do you need to try and sort out this technical problem? 10 minutes? We'll resume at 11:20, please.
chat so that they can check it in the room if that's possible. So just give me a 30 seconds worth of chat, please.
Okay, Deputy Richard Renoff of St Warwick, and have made a submission.
the state's response to it. I mean, just remind everybody what we're here to do, which is to look at the policy, NE3, and the extension of the Coast National Park and how that's applied. I'm interested to hear whether you think the boundary is being properly drawn and whether the policy itself is adequate to do that. And bearing in mind the management issue, I think has been explained. I know it's been repeated by Mr. Tilley, but people have asked questions about it. That is outside of the planning process, and it will be subject to consultation in due course. Clearly, the number of people affected by that will be determined by the outcome of this review process and our report about whether the park should be extended, and that still has to be recommended, or whether some other mechanism should take place. So they're the things that we should be concerned with. Mrs. Stephen, I gather you hadn't finished. I will come to you in a minute, Deputy Renouf, when I sort of actually interrupted a submission, but I haven't forgotten about you, and I'm very pleased. Could you just say something to check that we can hear you?
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes. Excellent. Thank you. Very good. Okay. Very good. Okay, Mrs. Stephen, have you got? I mean, I've made a note of some of your representations. I mean, you've made points about the interior agricultural land on the plateau being included. You've already raised that, I think.
Yes, I'd like to address you further, if I may.
About what?
Just to give context and try and answer some of your questions, sir. The thrust of policies in the countryside at the moment are very much about minimising and preventing development. The direction is for the built-up area to accept whatever happens. We've got a policy SP3, which we talked about earlier this week, which talks about development reflecting and enhancing character and function of the place where it's located. Well, function isn't just about landscape character, sir, and we've heard the Minister's representatives talk about the Jilska and where the boundaries are drawn, and it's our understanding that the Coastal National Park boundary as a land use zone is based on the findings of that assessment. And it would be my observation, sir, that what about the community function, the businesses, and the things that make the countryside work? Where is that assessment? Now, we heard about the sustainability appraisal informing that assessment of communities, and I'm really sorry to go back to consultation, but I'm not aware that that has been widely understood, and I'm really sorry to have to say that. And
well, I'm sorry, I asked you not to go back to it. I can't do anything about it.
Well, it would be useful, sir, to have some
clarity.
clarity.
Disputing? Hang on, no. Are you disputing that the regulatory framework has not been applied properly in relation to the consultation processes of this plan, or is anyone disputing that?
Well,
because if you're not, sir, then I don't want to hear about it. It's nothing I can. It's a waste of time, Mrs. Stephen. I'm sorry, it is.
It would be useful, sir, to understand the sustainability appraisal approach, what is in that document, and how that has informed the approach to the countryside. And again, this is based on this idea of the communities and their function and their role in the countryside, and how that has informed the Countryside National Park policy, sir. And it'd be useful to understand from the government and the Minister that point, if we're able to ask it.
Okay, well I mean, really, we're talking about a landscape designation here. Mm-hmm. This is today's session. The other policies have been dealt with. Do you want to make any comments about, is that relevant? Or if it is relevant, did you take it into account?
As we've already said, sir, we recognise that the island's coast and countryside is a living and working environment, and the planning policy regime set out in the plan seeks to respond to that. We've undertaken some work as part of the Island Plan Review, including the employment study, to look at the island's economic requirements. And that's reflected in the planning policy regime that we've set out.
In other policies, not the policy that we're really talking about.
Correct, sir. As you've stated, this is a planning policy that principally seeks to recognise and protect the landscape and seascape character.
I mean, Mr. Stephen, I should be holding a, I think you're coming to the session on economy, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I mean, I should be holding a session about that, and that's, I've got some questions, but that would be the appropriate point to raise the issue of whether the plan addresses the needs of the rural economy properly.
Okay, sir.
What else do you want to say about the landscape policy in the national park?
If I may ask a question, just to help my understanding and perhaps others in the room who I've heard talk about these issues. We've heard Mr. Pilley talk about the harm that there is to the areas outside of the current coastal national park boundary, and that being part of the justification for the extended
Yes, that was one of your questions.
Park.
What development since 2011 has been harmful to the national
in
park?
a separate session, sir, the Minister has said that, and forgive me if I've not recorded this correctly, 6% of new homes under the current plan have been provided in the countryside. That doesn't take account refurbishments or even any reduction in homes. And it'd be useful to know what the basis is of that harm and the basis of justification for the extended coastal national park, sir.
You want to respond to that?
I can pick up that, sir. We can provide a list of specific cases if that's of any help to you, but I think as we've discussed in relation to some of the housing policies that we talked about, it's not necessarily simply related to the provision of new dwellings in the countryside, sir. It's around the cumulative impact of change in the countryside and the slow erosion of countryside character as a result of new development, which may not create additional dwellings per se, but it may result in the extension of existing buildings or the urbanisation of those domestic curtilages and the impact that has on countryside character. So,
okay, thanks. You might be able to want to come back later on, but Deputy Renew, you've disappeared from my screen, but are you still there? Yes.
Yes, I'm still here, sir.
Right, good. Thank you very much. Okay, you've heard, I hope you've heard everything that's been said so far.
I have, sir, and I do apologise for the difficulties I seem to have caused. But I thank you for allowing me to contribute via Teams.
Absolutely no need for that at all. But anyway, I did ask Mr. Pilley's, in response to one of my earlier questions about your amendment, gave the Minister's current response that they want to proceed with the designation as extended and the policy framework as in NE3 as currently in the BIP. Would you like to try and come back on that and explain why? Do you think that will not adequately protect the coastal part, or do you wish to see a revision of the boundary and different measures applying within a different area? Did you hear that?
Yes, I did, sir. I can hear you. I do fear, sir, that the proposed extension will really diminish the effects of the coastal national park and its purposes, because it has been set up as a planning zone with particular purposes, which is to protect our most highly sensitive and vulnerable landscape quality. But by extending it to very diverse, very different landscapes, it seems to me, we will diminish the protection afforded to the really sensitive landscape character. So at present, sir, our coastal national park under the 2011 plan comprises 16% of the island's land area. And that is largely our dune lands, our coastal cliff areas, largely, but not exclusively, sparsely inhabited. under the proposal, sir, the proposed coastal national park area would cover approximately 30% of the island's land area, and I think that is a figure agreed by the minister.
Yes, it's not been disputed.
And I don't feel that is at all appropriate or proportionate to say that 30% of the island should be regarded as the most sensitive and valuable landscapes. It appears like a blunderbuss to protect what are, at its core, the most sensitive and valuable.
Hang on a minute. I mean, I think just to be well, you seem to be saying then that that's too. Are you saying that the policy NE3 as applied to that boundary wouldn't diminish the restrictions that are applied within that area, would they? It would extend the extensions, the policy. I'm not phrasing this very well. It would extend the policy framework to a wider area, but it would still be the same more restrictive policy framework than applies in the green zone.
Yes, so it would be applying a policy which is appropriate for areas of very sensitive landscape to an area which is of a different nature. It comprises large areas of the interior agricultural plateau. It comprises a very significant amount of houses and businesses and other land uses. And I believe it's incumbent on the minister to set out just how many people this would affect. And we don't have that information. That assessment hasn't been made, but it's clearly going to affect many residential areas, which are of it's an ordinary part of our rural landscape, but not of that sensitive nature that is comprised within the current national park. And so the present coastal national park boundaries have been drawn by reference to roads, to the chance location of roads around our island. And I don't understand why that is appropriate. Why a property on one side of a road should fall within the coastal national park and be treated as having being in an area of sensitivity and particular value, and a property on the other side of that road be outside of that area. There's been no proper consideration of what are appropriate areas to be included in a national park. There's no reason why field boundaries can't be used. Field boundaries are accurately recorded on maps and in our land registration system. So are all residential property boundaries. So there was a letter written to me by a parishioner after the plan was publicised, pointing out that in St. One's there is a small valley which that parishioner wished to be included in the coastal national park, but because a road crossed through the valley, the head of that valley, which he considered and I consider a particularly beautiful area, was not included in the national park, and he thought it should be. And he was asking me, well, why have they drawn the boundary at the road? So that's an example of somebody wishing to extend beyond a road because they are thinking about the particular quality of the landscape in that area. But by using the chance occurrence of roads, there's no thought being given to the quality of what is being included in the proposed national park, which is why I brought my amendment forward, because I would support a proper extension of the boundaries of the coastal national park, but it needs to be considered properly. And the trouble with the evidence base at the moment is it arose as a result of a single workshop, which was held, as one participant has said, during a time of COVID emergency in the island when people's minds were on so many other things. And I don't think that's sufficient to use simply that evidence base coming from one workshop.
Well, I mean, just as a factual point there, Deputy Minister, I mean, there was the workshop, but there was an awful lot of other work that took place before that workshop, from the Fiona Fife reports, or the ILSCA report, and then subsequent to that, the review report itself, which I'm obviously taking into account. Now, I mean, I've already heard that some people don't think that evidence base is very strong, or that I should not give it as much weight as the states have done in using it to define the boundaries. I mean, that's one of the things we've got to look at and come to a view on. I mean, I've made a note of, I have been round to a lot of these areas, and I've actually driven along the road that you've talked about more than once in my visits to the island, looking at that and the landscape either side of it. So, but I think it's not quite right just to say it was just a workshop.
The point I'd like to make about the Jilska is that that was brought forward, and my understanding is that it assess the various landscapes within the island in terms of their quality. It wasn't something that was suggesting that, for example, the interior agricultural plateau should be put together with our coastal national plains and spoken of as a coastal national park. They were, in fact, it confirmed the differences between the various areas. So this is the problem, I think, that the proposal lumps together so many areas identified as having different qualities in the Jilska, so that we now have a conglomerate comprising 30% of the island, which I believe is just inappropriate, and it's not clear exactly what the effects of that will be, because of the management implications and the confusion that's arisen. So I propose a proper process. I don't think it is appropriate for a national park to exist as simply as a planning policy. This should have a parliamentary view applied to it, and the island's parliament should govern the national park at its highest level by creating legislation for it. And those who live and work in a national park should contribute to its existence and how it runs, rather than the Minister for the Environment exercising a planning remit.
Okay, I mean, I understand. We've actually discussed that, and as I've said, I'm aware clearly the national park framework in the UK, for example, in England is different in terms of the purposes from the Countryside Act 1949, and you seem to be saying that really is that what Jersey should, if you like, adopt that sort of approach, have the park and its purposes identified and set out in a new act passed by your Parliament?
It is, sir, because I think that is the way that is national parks are brought forward in most jurisdictions. In the case in Scotland and the United States, I understand from my limited research I have done on the subject. That would seem far more appropriate to me.
Okay, and in the meantime, what do you think should happen with regard to the Bridging Island plan then? That the extension should be deleted and that the policy NE3 applies just to the original designated area?
Yes, sir, until proper consideration is given to additional areas that might be brought within the national park.
And what in the you meant do you mention an Alaska? Do you this area of outlands?
Yes.
Are you proposing that we should recommend that in the meantime, or just that leave the rest of the area within that extended piece as green zone? I mean, it's a question really, first of all, and also, I mean, it seems to me that could possibly lead to sort of another complication. What policy framework would apply within the Alaska as you propose it?
I would suggest that the Coastal National Park should be limited to its present boundaries for the moment, and that the green zone should apply to the area that is between the present boundaries and the proposed boundaries, because I think the same arguments apply to the Alaska. Is it appropriate for 30% of the island's land base to be designated as the area with the highest planning protection we give, the area that needs it? Does 30% of the island need the highest level? Because I do fear that if that is suggested, it means that those smaller areas that we really need to concentrate on and preserve as being of the highest sensitivity, that concentration on them will just get lost as the planners will seek to navigate, managing all sorts of difficulties that arise because there's so much activity within the remainder of the zone, with people living and working in it and needing to make applications and contesting how they can use their properties. So I think there should be a clear distinction between what we have now, the Coastal National Park with the highest sensitive areas, and the areas of a different nature which are proposed to be incorporated in this Alaska.
Okay, I think that's I think that's clear. So what you're saying, with the green zone policies applied to that. So this is, but so that's in the interim plan for the interim plan period. And in the meantime, while the interim plan is in place, policy NE3 applies to the Coastal National Park as identified. But there is then a review of the park, whether there. I presume you're intending there should still be a further review, that some areas might still be included within possibly an extended national park that would go before your Parliament for ratification with additional purposes, possibly. Is that a summary of your point, your case?
I suppose yes, it is, sir. I think our Coastal National Park has been a success and it deserves greater recognition and promotion. So we need to put it into legislation. We need to establish a structure around it which involves the communities living in it, and they, together with planners and all stakeholders, will bring forward suggestions for amending the boundaries.
Okay. Right, thanks very much. Do stay there.
I will.
So I'm going to ask Mr. I might take some other. I'll let you come back to that. I mean, maybe at the end there's still some other people who want to speak. Is there anyone on the? Well, the people on the front row have had their boards up as well as people on the back row for some time. So we've got Mr. Perchard, yes. And where are you from, please?
I'm Robert Perchard. I'm a dairy farmer in the parish of St Martin's. I'm also president of the Royal Jersey Agriculture and Horticultural Society, which our CEO, James Godfrey, is here as well. Sir, you've said that you don't want to hear any more about the consultation, but I just want to
well, I did mean it.
I just wanted to say that you talked about the evidence base for this move to extend the national park, and I can supply you on a document a number of the various reports that took place in this consultation, which do not show a demand for the extension of the national park, and certainly no call from the public whatsoever for it. It came in later on in the Alaska report, and it was sort of inserted, as far as I can see, in that way.
Okay, well, I've got those. I mean,
Yeah.
I've got those evidence,
Right,
those,
okay.
the background
But it's,
reports.
I'll hand it to you as a
What
separate...
about the
Well, I wanted to
substantive
say-
merits of the proposed extension and
First
the
of all,
policy framework?
the Coastal National Parks is absolutely brilliant. We all understand a wonderful resource and a great asset to Jersey, possibly a victim of its own success. Hence, perhaps the need to enlarge it, to sort of spread the footfall and dilute the impact, possibly. But what I would say is, at the moment, and probably a lot of Jersey people don't know this, the extent of the national park stops at the high water mark. So the beaches and the shore, the sea around the island, are not in the national park. So a lot of what the Coastal National Park activities are about, which is the beaches, water sports, boating, kayaking, etc., swimming, are taking place outside the national park as it is. There's an obvious, makes logical sense now that I think the ownership of the beaches, the foreshore is better understood, that there is a move seaward on the boundaries.
Yes, I've got a question about that, actually, for the states, because, I mean, I can understand, it almost goes back to Deputy Renouf's point about what are the purposes and maybe you should redefine them through an act, but my understanding, I mean, the planning policy is really to control development. Now, I can't imagine that are there any types of development that are likely to occur between high and low water?
Just to respond to that, sir, our planning powers extend all the way to our territorial limits, and one of the issues that emerge from the work that's been undertaken is the impact of development on the coast when viewed from the sea or from the beach. So one of the issues is around intervisibility between land and sea, and I think we're also conscious that at the moment our planning policy regime for the marine environment is relatively unsophisticated, sir, and we anticipate there's likely to be increased pressure for development activity in that area related to things like offshore renewable energy generation, whether that's distant offshore or whether it's closer to the coast. Also things like...
but is that development in your context? In context of Jersey planning law?
It is, sir. So any proposals for offshore wind or for any tidal lagoon infrastructure, any pressures that might arise as a result of coastal management, sir, so things like changes to sea defences, potential for land reclamation.
Okay, all right, that's okay, that answers my question, I think, really. I mean, I'm not aware, actually, that anyone is objecting to the extension of the park out to the low water mark from any of the representations I've heard. I'm getting a lot of nods of heads to confirm that position. Yeah. Okay. Right, so was there anything else you wanted to raise?
If I may, sir. As I say, the national coastal national park, but which coastal national park are we talking about? There's the one with the planning designation, which is protection of the landscape and biodiversity, which I would have thought must be first and foremost, particularly in this forum. But there's also the other aspect of the national park, which is the opportunity to understand and enjoy and have access to the countryside.
Well,
but that is stated in the Bridging Island Plan, sir. And thirdly to that...
we've heard, but just a minute, let's just be clear about this, because I mean, that's dealt with by another minister and is not really part of this planning policy.
Absolutely, that's the point I wish to make. There's a fundamental conflict there between the two principles. And also the third principle, which Jersey Coastal National Park Limited has, sir, is to exploit it for the economy of the island. So it is, as James Godfrey said, it is a mess, really, and there's conflicting interests. And I would have thought this forum is about the planning designation.
I've tried to keep it to that, yes.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to talk about. But it's being muddled by these other aspects which need to be clarified. And that's a good example why it needs to be constituted properly in law.
But I thought, well, okay, so you're supporting Deputy Renew's proposal maybe, but
Yes.
I mean, as far as what we have to do, I'm sorry, I should have introduced Mr. Holland, obviously, this is Mr. Holland, who's the lead inspector, who's sitting in on this. You know, what we've got to decide is the planning side of it. Now, I'm quite clear, I thought, that management issues and economy, what the economy might be relevant within it, which we'll talk about, but we're just talking really about the planning issues today.
That's what I wanted to come on to, if I may, just quickly, and that is the fact that to myself, it's illogical that there is a landward growth of the proposed national park boundaries, which is all contiguous with the coast, when inside the island there are, for example, the inland valleys that are not included, possibly the escarpment on the Grouville St Clement escarpment, which is visible from the sea and has a high landscape quality. But I get the impression that it's all about making a single landmass rather than possibly parcels of land. For example, Queen's Valley is not included. Now, surely that is of really high value.
Sorry, where's that?
Queen's Valley is a reservoir that's on the east side of the island. That's inland.
Well, some of
it's a public.
Some of these valleys. Could you point, Mr. Pilley? Oh, I see. Yeah. I mean, some of these valleys. I think that's part of the point, isn't it? The old park boundary did include some of the valleys that sort of extended.
Well, that's my point. So 3 or 4 of the inland valleys are included. The Roselle and St Catherine's valleys, yes, and the Lemuria and Great Villec, I think. But other notable, beautiful valleys such as Waterworks Valley and others, which is in the southern part of the island, but because they're not contiguous with the coast, they've been excluded. It's almost like there has to be the word land grab was used, to appropriate, I'm going to use another emotive word, land that forms a single mass which joins in with the coastal national park. It's all, to my mind, it's all about growing the park as an entity rather than preserving the valuable landscape features that the island has. And so this idea of Alaska's, possibly there is merit in having an elevated level of protection for certain areas, but they don't have to be the ones that just touch the coast. There are other areas which could be defined if it was proven to be necessary. My final point is that in this, the new delineation of the internal boundary, Mr. Pilley said it's not been based on the view from the sea, which is one of the opinions that has been put around. But within that area, and as Deputy Renouf quite rightly said, there are areas of not of high value landscape importance that are, simply because of convenience, have been encompassed in it. So the whole thing needs thorough looking at. And you know, as somebody who operates a business an agricultural business in this newly subsumed area, as I've said in my submission, it could have very detrimental effects to the viability of our business. But that's aside. Thank you, sir.
Well, that's in relation to policy NE3, or the permitted development issues are outside of our remit here.
That's right. Well, it's just that it may limit potential diversification, for example.
Okay. Would that be any different than if it was just stayed in the green zone?
Possibly not, but that is perhaps the point, so that the green zone is actually working in these protected valleys that are excluded. We've got a system that actually works at the moment, so is there really any need to change it?
Okay. I'll let you deal with some of these at the end, Mr. Pilley, I think. Who's the next gentleman along? Société Générale. Who are you, please?
Hi, my name's John Pennell. I'm representing the Société today.
And did you want to make a comment about the extent of the area?
Yes, please.
Right. What was your point?
So the Société feel we don't have any misunderstandings about the purpose of the national park, and we recognise the value of conserving those special qualities that Jersey has and which need protecting for future generations, including the field patterns and the valleys as much as the cliffs and the dunes. We welcome the fact that a larger area will help Jersey fulfil our various MEA commitments, and we support the extension to make the park more apparent to the public of the island, which we think will in turn lead to greater appreciation of the natural environment, which is what a national park is all about. We agree with the parishes and the deputies in regarding the definition of the boundaries by using roads as landscape features, and also about the lack of designating the inland valleys, perhaps.
So what you're seeking, a further review of the boundary to possibly include more land, or do you want that in a different designation, as Mr. Pershard said?
We feel that the boundary should take the whole ecosystem approach, and rather than use convenient boundary features, take in the extent of habitats which fall across that boundary. That's not to say we wouldn't welcome the current boundary. It's obviously far better than the previous iteration of the national park.
Right, so sorry, you're supporting the extension?
Absolutely, yes. But we think it should go further and take a whole ecosystem approach. The idea that the boundary currently cuts through areas, like it was pointed out earlier, there was a valley mentioned in St Wands, which has been cut in half because the
So it should go across the road, yes. Okay.
Yeah. So we feel that areas like that where the habitat itself, which is being protected with the national park, fall within and outside the boundary, that the boundary should be extended to include those whole areas. The purpose of a national park, one of the purposes is to protect the biodiversity, and obviously biodiversity relies on ecosystems and whole habitats. They don't recognise the artificial boundaries that we're using.
Is there anything else any other points about the policy itself?
Only that we would like to see it extended beyond low water and to include some of the marine habitats which we feel is lacking.
Okay. I'd like a response to that, please. We're going to come on to the marine spatial plan. I'm going to say we'll cut this short, maybe in about half an hour, so we've got at least some time to talk about that. And finally, Ms. Scott, you've been very patient. What was your point, please?
I have more than one, sir. First of all, I'd like to focus on the inspector's task of assessing whether an appropriate strategy has been adopted in this situation. And in that respect, I'd like to point out the incongruities that have arisen from this the redefinition of what is regarded as green zone, which traditionally was farming land, and this extended coastal national park. I can use as an illustration the, if I refer you to the St Brellard's Bay character appraisal, there were recommendations made in respect of certain areas of land, and in particular I would refer you to the areas marked 6, which all more or less look the same in terms of the they are covered in trees, they are not farmland, they actually provide part of a very scenic backdrop to St Brellard's Bay. I too also attended the workshop, and I was interested in the strategy that was used and presented to the participants in terms of how Coastal National Park would be defined. And we were presented with a map and told that if we felt certain areas should be included, they needed to comply with certain criteria. I'm sure, Mr. Pilley, because it was a very short document that just had 8 items on it, including artistic interests. But basically, my organisation pointed out that part of this area, numbered 6, even though it was designated green zone, is not farmed. It hasn't been farmed for years, and it also wasn't farmed as a result of the 1989 Environmental Improvement Plan, which to which the current island plan makes reference, 4.86, which the States Assembly said should be relevant to all future island plans. And of course, it is part of your remit to look at the decisions of the States Assembly as well. So anyway, basically, as a result of the strategy that has been used, part of this land remains in green zone, even though it's not farmed. I'm hearing protests.
Sorry, are you saying it should be included in an extended national park?
I believe it should be, and the only reason it hasn't been is because of this strategy of forming one block, as far as I can see it. And I personally don't see the actual rationale of this strategy. We are a small island. Why would we not have small pockets of coastal national park? Moving on, if I may.
Well, okay. Well, I'll take that into account. And we have been to St Bernard's Bay, actually, but I'll look at your submission again and look at that.
Didi, you have no doubt looked at the St Bernard's Bay character appraisal with its recommendations, which at the time that the Minister representations are drafted, he referred to this as a matter being explored. He did not refer to the actual produced report, and therefore nothing in this island plan actually encompasses the recommendations in that report, with the possible exception of an economic strategy, which we won't discuss here because I know we have limited time and it will be discussed elsewhere. So moving on to the strategy of basically taking out a lot of content in respect of the Coastal National Park and having the public look at the General Development Order, which is not actually part of your remit. Now, I personally think that, one, it is a very difficult document to follow for the public, and number two...
what is?
The General Development Order that actually explains...
Yeah, okay, but so what...
Well, I'm
but
saying
that's not part of my remit, so
no,
what...
exactly, sir. That's what I'm saying. The strategy has been that actually the extent to which you can have development in these areas is not part of your remit.
Okay, so there's nothing...
A consultation...
there's nothing we can do about that?
Well, I do believe that part of your remit is to actually make a comment on whether an appropriate strategy has been adopted. So I'm simply giving you this evidence so that you may make that assessment accordingly.
Well, okay.
Because indeed, it also extends to whether it's based on proportionate
Well, so what
evidence.
are you saying then, that there should be a policy written into the plan to say that permitted development rights or some permitted development rights as currently defined are withdrawn within this certain zone? Is that what you're saying to me, that you should it be?
I'm not presuming to suggest what the findings of the inspector should be in terms of whether an appropriate.
But you're here to try and influence our recommendations. I mean, if that. Okay, I've asked you the question.
I think that
if that's what you think we should do.
The recommendation has got to be to reconsider these boundaries in the context of the representations made. That basically certain parts of the island should be covered. And that maybe it would be helpful to have evidence, because talking about strategies again, which I believe are there to address problems. It's not clear to me where the problem was with some of this area of green zone that is farmed. Well,
that's Mrs. Stevens' point. I'll ask Mr. Pilley to address that in a minute.
Absolutely. So basically, I believe that you might consider the extent to which, based on whatever evidence is being provided to you, that it is appropriate to take all of the areas of the Coastal National Park that was previously in green zone and redesignate it as such, particularly where it is farmland, and also reconsider the extent to which the Coastal National Park should be confined to areas more or less that join up with each other. It just does not make sense.
Okay. There are quite a few points for you to... Thank you very much. Mr. Pilley, do you want to come back on the points that have been made since then?
Yes, sir, I can pick up on some of those. So perhaps starting with Mr. Pershard, who seems to be arguing for an extension of the Coastal National Park to to include some of the other valleys in the island. As set out in the evidence base, there was consideration made to different parts of the island's landscape, and in the appendix to the report there'll be an assessment as to why different parts were included and excluded. Picking up on that point, in relation to the point made by Ms. Scott, she refers to Part 6 in the St Brellard's Bay character appraisal work. Just to clarify, sir, some of the area defined as Part 6 in that report is included in the Coastal National Park. So the area to the west of St Brellard's Bay, leading up to Le Creux, has been included in the extended Coastal National Park. Other parts of Part 6 form part of the built-up area and are defined as green backdrop zone, and that's an area that we will be seeking to discuss later, sir.
Yes, well, briefly, I think, but yes. Okay, yeah.
Just going back to Mr. Pershard's point, you pressed him on the impact of the potential change upon his business interests, his farming interests. As we've stated, sir, there's economic policy set out.
Speak up a bit.
Sorry, as we've stated, sir, there's economic policy set out in the plan that look at issues like rural diversification and support for existing farming activities within the countryside. As we've discussed, sir, this is a landscape consideration, which would be one material consideration as part of any proposals to make changes to development activity on a business located in the countryside.
Okay, we'll bear that in mind. But what about this point, though, that's been made by more than one person about what's wrong with the current framework? What's happening in the green backdrop zone near the national park that shouldn't be happening?
Green centre.
Sorry? No, sorry, the green zone.
Centre,
Getting them confused. Yeah, sorry, the green zone itself.
Well, I think there's concern, sir, that there's an erosion of the quality of the countryside. There's creeping urbanisation, there's a change to the character of the countryside, and we've seen throughout the countryside parts of our landscape character diminished as a result of that development, either because the planning policy regime is not strong enough, sir, or that certain levels of certain types of development are not currently regulated. So, for example, we've seen small-scale development which can have a significant impact on the countryside. So things like creation of entrances to dwellings in the countryside with formalised gates and boundary treatments. We've seen things like the introduction of lighting, sir. We've seen some development which may just exceed the permitted development rights, but can still have a significant impact on the visual, where it's prominent.
Where it's within the permitted development rights.
Well, either within or just above permitted development rights currently, depending on its position and location in the countryside, can have a significant visual impact. And I think there's a concern, certainly one that's held by the Minister, that we need to ensure that we have a more robust planning policy regime to be able to deal with some of those challenges. And as we've discussed when we talked about housing sites, we talked about the sites on either side of the road. Going back to Deputy Renouf's point about the apparent difficulty of being able to distinguish the value of the landscape quality on one side of a road relative to the other side of the road. We spent much of the last couple of days talking about the differences between the qualities of some housing sites, and I think that is evidence that you are able to distinguish between impact on different types of landscape character depending on its location relative to things like built-up areas. Sir.
But some of the people here are saying you're going to exacerbate those problems because of the way that the boundaries have been drawn along roads.
Well, I think people are, it seems to me, sir, are arguing that it's difficult to distinguish between the landscape value in different parts of the island. Clearly, we've got some evidence base that seeks to assess the objective qualities of different parts of landscape character, and then to distinguish between those in terms of whether they ought to be included within the Coastal National Park or not.
Yeah.
And clearly, the evidence base sets that out against some clear criteria. And clearly it's there for people to judge whether or not they think those criteria have been satisfied. As you stated,
well,
sir...
That's our role. We've talked a lot about this. I think we are going to be here sometimes while we're not sitting. So, we haven't formulated a clear plan yet, but I think it's quite possible we'll be going out to look at some other sites and some other areas before we depart to write our report.
Okay, fine.
Mr. Pershard. Oh, sorry, hang on. Mr. Luce actually has been wanting to speak for some time.
Thank you, sir. I'm Deputy for St Martin, representing my constable and my parish today, along with all the other parishes you see on the table and across the North Coast. So if the Minister's looking to a planning designation and policy to protect landscape and seascape character, he has got us all very confused. And the three words that confuse us are coastal, national park. The coastal word's confusing because in my parish we have areas designated for potential protection under Coastal National Park which are miles away from the coast, so I would say to you that the word coastal needs to be removed. And I'm not going to reiterate, although I just touch on it, the confusion over national park, because while I accept that from management terms in planning terms, that would be development control and building control, to the farmers in my parish, management means the management of fields, which very clearly comes under a national park setting where people outside of the regulatory framework and government would have control over the management of the way farms are farmed. The other concern for many of my parishioners is access, and I know that's not a planning issue as well, but quite clearly in Jersey, where the Coastal National Park team promote picnicking in the park, islanders will expect, if these proposed areas are designated, to be allowed to picnic in the park. I leave that there, sir. The reason I believe that we've gone...
That can only be on public land, can't it?
Well, the invitation is to picnic in the park, irrespective of whether the park is public land, private land, or land owned by NGOs or what have you.
Okay,
but I won't dwell on that. The reason I believe that we have such a large area proposed in front of us is this 30% target, and we've been told it's not a target, so I have to tell you it is. The Prime Minister of the UK is committed to protecting 30%. In a boost for biodiversity, but the target is set to protect at least 30% of land and sea by 2030, and that's part of a package being negotiated currently under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity for the next decade or beyond. So it is a target, and it's a target which has quite clearly been set.
By whom? By your government?
No, but it's a generally accepted target around the world that we should be aiming for. And I would say to you, sir, that the 30% was the starting point for this Coastal National Park review. And that we've come, or the proposers of it, as ministers come at it from exactly the wrong direction. In trying to set these large areas, we've spoken about boundaries. I have a constituent in my parish. The boundary of the Coastal National Park goes straight through the middle of his farm unit. And I say to you, sir, in planning terms, we have listings and we enjoy being told about applications in the setting of a listed building, but we would never allow a planning designation to pass through the middle of a farm unit, where on one side of a farmyard a planning designation might occur and on the other side it might not.
By farm unit, you mean buildings, or do you mean a group of fields?
I mean physical buildings. I don't mean halfway through the unit.
Okay.
So my point to you, sir, is to consider whether the 30% was the driving force behind this before it started, and the detail, as we've already heard from everybody around the table, seems to have been lost.
Well, okay, I've been told that 30% wasn't a target, I will consider the merits of the extension on its merits as a landscape value. Mr. Morrell, is it? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. Very quickly, Deputy for St Lawrence, I put in the amendment for Waterworks Valley, greater access to Waterworks Valley, and actually I wanted to briefly touch on that because my initial thought there was to bring an amendment to make it part of the Coastal National Park, but I realised the Coastal National Park has puts restrictions on landowners, and therefore to go ahead with such an amendment would require a great deal of consultation, in my view, in order to be fair. So restricted my amendment to just the national park, to just access. But I think.
So what have you
do understand
withdrawn that, or have you?
No, it's been accepted by the
that's not part of the national park that I was thinking of, so I can't remember your amendment.
Yeah, no,
it's
been accepted by the minister. Is the only
it's been accepted
by the minister, as I understand it. Yes.
Okay,
the only amendment to be. But I just wanted to highlight that as I can understand that landowners caught within this planning designation are concerned about the restrictions it places upon their land, and so consultation, as has been mentioned, is important. But the piece I wanted to really point out was the confusion that you've heard today about Coastal National Park as a planning zone and Coastal National Park as a kind of economic entity with, or it's not just economic, but social entity as well, in terms of something which is managed by a team, someone who is here today, in terms of a park that people enter, enjoy and leave. And to that end, sir, I would suggest a strong recommendation to rename the planning zone of the Coastal National Park, so it is no longer called the Coastal National Park in planning terms, because that is leading to a great deal of confusion around the table. We can hear this. In planning terms, it is about greater restrictions on that area for the protection of the natural environment for various reasons. And it will be up to you as inspector to determine whether those boundaries are appropriate or should be changed. And
whether the policy context for them is appropriate as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I leave it entirely up to you on those terms. I would just suggest that, irrespective, by renaming or relabelling this area in planning terms, it will then make a clearer distinction between the national park as an area that people enjoy, that is managed for people to access and enjoy and have picnics in, and the planning zone, which places greater restrictions on landowners. I think it's really important because the public are clearly confused. Thank you.
Okay, there have been two boards up behind. I'll try and come round. Mr. Aluta, are you on National Trust for Jersey? Yes. Yeah, good morning. What I've read your representations about this. I'm trying to think have you got any new points that you want to make that are differentiated from what we've already heard this morning?
Well, only that I think there's been a lot of negativity about the National Park proposal, and obviously from our perspective we positively support the extension of the National Park. I don't think the current boundaries actually work. They haven't worked for a long time. They were based on the zone of outstanding character, which was a landscape character assessment, as opposed to National Park criteria, and therefore that's why they didn't work. And actually Steve Luce has mentioned one point, but actually the National Park boundary as it currently exists goes through the middle of a house at the Coop, so it was permitted extension because half of it was in the National Park, half of it wasn't. So there's already problems with the existing park. I think also that there's been a lack of recognition that this presents a wonderful opportunity for the island. The fact that we actually have landscape worthy of protection, equivalent to 30% of our island, is something that we should be incredibly proud of, and actually we should be seeking to protect. I also think that there's been a lot of discussion about those people today from the people who live in the park, but actually we have a huge population which lives outside the park, and this is about protecting an asset for the benefit of the majority of our islanders and not the minority. And I think that's an incredibly important point, and that's what planning seeks to do. It's about the greater benefit. I also can provide some clarification on the 30% target. When the boundaries were reassessed, I actually asked Fiona Fife what amount it came to, and she actually had to do a calculation. They hadn't, at that point, calculated what the extended national park equated to, and it took them 2 days to do that calculation, and I think it came to 29.4%, and then she gave me that information, which then subsequently did appear in a JEP article, which some people have referred to today.
She didn't do a calculation of residential properties, did she?
She didn't, no.
Okay.
Also, what's really interesting is some of the objectors have talked about the existing national park, and it's really important, I think. Remember, we've got a national park already, and they've described it as brilliant and successful. So why on earth would you not want to extend something that's brilliant and successful? St Juan's Bay is a living, working, farming environment. It combines all those things. It's been in existence for 10 years, and I haven't seen a lot of people objecting to working and living in that environment in St Juan's Bay. So it does work. It is a planning policy. There's lots of discussion here about things outside of planning policy, and it's really important that we focus on that issue, that it is a planning policy to protect our most sensitive areas from inappropriate development. That's what it is, that's what's on the jar, and that's what we need to stick to. And that's what I'd like to say.
Yes, thank you. Well, I've tried to keep to that myself, but Mr. Gibb, is it?
Thank you. Anthony Gibb, St Martin's Conservation Trust. We submitted a representation on behalf of residents in St Martin, and St Martin is affected greatly by this. The representation is that there is not, from those the trustees have spoken to, great concern about the principle of planning control, but there is great concern about the use of the words national park. And we had suggested an alternative term should be used. This would separate, as Deputy Morell has just pointed out, the issues of the lack of the fact that there is a national park here. There's a desire to have one, but it doesn't actually exist, from the planning framework which you're concerned with. So it is simply a suggestion that the terminology should be changed for this, and this would result in less concern from the residents living within the proposed national park. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one gentleman who's brought up who's not spoken yet. Who are you, please?
Thank you. Well, perhaps I'm the most important person in the room. I'm Jim Hopley. I'm the honouring chairman of Jersey National Park Limited, okay? I carry other responsibilities, and I will declare them because they are relevant. I also chair Genuine Jersey, which is the island's provenance mark, and one subset of that is an organisation called Farm Jersey, which is there to support the agricultural industry, the fisheries industry, and the aquaculture industry. So I've listened with a lot of intent this morning to the observations and the concerns of all raised in the room. A lot of them are valid. I understand some of the frustrations there. You've tried to keep the discussion to the area that you're actually responsible for making the decision on. And I think that is absolutely critical in this. We, in our original involvement in this, asked for two or three things. We didn't particularly ask for a massive extension to the existing designated national park, and we used the word national park. We'd long since dropped the coastal reference because it does move into the interland in certain areas down the road. When we registered the charity, when we registered the company that oversees it, it's registered as the Jersey National Park, not as the Coastal National Park. We actually asked for a little bit more clarity on the boundaries, and I think participants today have indicated confusion of what's currently in the park, what's not in the park. I think what came out of Fiona Fowth's recommendations was that perhaps roads were used. It could have easily have been fields were used, etc., etc.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, that's just to be clear. I mean, that review and the review itself uses a variety of physical features to designate the extent of the park.
But we also understood the need, because of the housing pressures on the island, to exclude by tweaking the boundary around built-up areas, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, we do appreciate
many of the issues that have been raised today. So our stance is, if you bring in Alaska or whatever it's called, it'll just add another level of complexity. The public don't understand the current boundaries, and if you bring in something else, another designation, we will just confuse what's already a confused situation. We are concerned about issues of access. We are concerned about issues of respect when you use the park. It's easy to say, well, you're advocating picnics, but, we're in the middle of launching a major campaign that actually says, if you use this asset for all people in the island, then do it in the appropriate way.
Leave only footprints.
Yeah, very much so. So, there is a...
Okay, what about, do you have any comment on Deputy Renouf's idea of a different statutory framework for the park?
I think we've been asking, when I say there's a park management committee at the moment, it consists of 2 volunteers, neither of who are particularly young. We've got 1 part-time paid officer who's fully occupied, and we've got a few volunteers. So that's what it actually consists of. We are creating a governance structure, which is now through all the hurdles that we've had to go through in terms of the company, and the intention in that governance structure is to invite many of the people sitting in this room to be part of that, so that we do engage with all the stakeholders we can possibly engage with as this project's been taken forward. So our stance at the moment is, it might not be perfect, but let's run with what's proposed. Let's take in the
as extended.
Yeah, let's take in the foreshore. Let's look at what we can do in the marine environment. I know you're trying to get to that in a moment in time.
Yeah, well, I'm really going to try and wrap this up.
The last thing I would say is, we do recognise, and we've been asking as a very small management committee for a considerable period of time now, for government to actually tell us what they want us to do to take this project forward. And I think what Deputy Renouf's proposed, and other people have brought reference to today, about moving the legal framework that sits behind the park, will start to give us a bit of certainty on what the island actually require from the project, rather than myself and my colleagues inventing it as we go along.
Okay, so you don't object to that, but you want to keep things as they are with the extension and the planning policy framework, and in the meantime, you would be happy to cooperate in moving that forward.
The consultation will start from day one afterwards, and lots of the interest groups in this room, including politicians. We've asked the Committee of Conductabs to nominate 2 participants that can partake in the discussions. They can't become directors of the company, but they can take part in discussion, as can nominated officers from both the Economic Development Department and the Environment Department. On that basis, I rest my case.
Yeah, thank you very much for your contribution. Mr. Pershard, did you want to make a very
quickly,
brief point?
I thought I needed to come back on a factual inaccuracy of Mr. Pilley when he said I was advocating an extension of the national park into the inland valleys. No, I didn't say that. In fact, I'm opposed to at this stage, any increase in the footprint of the national park. But about the national valleys, if I could quote from the boundary review, page 46, the section about inland valleys, the comment reasons against inclusion, it says here, there are other planning tools available to protect open areas, countryside, woodland and recreational features. In other words, to protect valleys, but those tools surely are available to the areas that are being proposed to include in the national park, because they are open areas, countryside, woodland, etc. So I thought I had to put the record straight. Interestingly, sir, if I may very quickly, in the same box it says here, it has been agreed that the national park is a coastal national park, as it is primarily the coastal and marine aspects of Jersey's landscape and environment that are of particular significance. So this is in the boundary review.
Well, yeah, okay. I'm going to go to Deputy Renouf. I did say I'd come back to you if you wanted to comment on anything that you've heard since you spoke. Do you want to?
Thank you for that opportunity, sir.
Again, unmute, please. Or
sorry, I feel
that's it.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Thank you for that opportunity, sir. I don't feel there's anything more I can add, really. I think I don't. I think I should just make one point that I should have made at the beginning, and that I have declared in my proposition, that I have an interest in this, in that a close family member has property which is presently partly in the national park, and were the Minister's suggestion to be approved, it would be wholly in the national park. So I declare that interest, but it is not my motivation for pursuing this. But
So thank you for that. I mean, that's clear. I mean, and we've, as you hope you've understood, we've understood your representations as together with all the rest of them that have been here. I think I'm going to ask Mr. Pilley to, or Mr. Oh yeah, okay. Mrs. Steedman, I hope it's a very quick point.
It is very quick, and it's intended to be helpful, sir. And it's some planning history, planning policy history, which Mr. Pilley might remember the detail of it better than I. But the 2002 plan used to have a distinction for the countryside. There was a sensitive landscape area of the agricultural priority zone, I think it was called, as well as a green zone. And so it's just to make the point that there has been historically different approaches within the countryside, and it might be helpful to understand why that, there's been a move away from that. That was just the point to make,
okay.
So thank you.
Ms. Scott, was it a new point?
I just wanted to make a quick clarification of, in respect of Mr. Pilley's response. When I've referred to number 6 in the appraisal, I'm actually talking about character areas. I don't dispute that part of a character area has been redesignated as Coastal National Park, but we are talking about an area that also is characterised as green zone, not green backdrop zone, as Mr. Pilley said, which is conventionally farming land, despite the fact it's not farmed.
Okay, thank you. Is this a new point?
Very briefly,
yes. Yes. Microphone, please.
Sorry. In regard to Deputy Reneff's point about the need for an Act of the State, that is again part of the confusion. This planning designation does not need to have a separate Act of the States in order to be made real. The planning designation that we are discussing today will go through the States, will be rejected or not as part of the debate on the island plan. An Act of the States to set up a particular actual national park that is managed by the people who run the national park, that's a completely separate matter altogether.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
And I just want to make that very clear, because it's just because you asked Mr. Hopley whether or not he felt an Act of the States was necessary, and absolutely not. In terms of planning
trying to
areas,
get his
it's
expertise. I mean, I'm wondering what we've got to consider. I'm interested in his views on Deputy Renew's proposal, because I think he's got a legitimate interest in that. And
that proposal comes from a confusion of these two issues.
Yeah, but it affects actually our recommendation about Deputy Renew's amendment. Okay, Mr. Pilley, we've got maybe 20 minutes to spend on the marine park, or just maybe a bit more, but I mean, that should be enough from my point of view, actually. Can you briefly, I'm not going to take any more, and sum up, please, anything that you want to come back on. Don't repeat anything you've already said.
Sure, okay, I'll try and pick up some of the points that perhaps haven't been addressed yet, sir. Firstly, you asked about our view on the comment that was made about extending the boundaries beyond the low water mark for the Coastal National Park. As part of the work that was undertaken to review the boundaries, we looked at that, and it's a significant step to go into the marine environment, and the proposed extension straddles both the terrestrial
we're going to talk about that in just
marine
a minute,
area.
So
well, I think we need to be clear about the purposes of the designation here. So I think we're going to talk about protection of biodiversity. Subsequently, this is perhaps a bit broader in terms of embracing landscape character too. So I think the consideration was that it should reflect existing designations related to the Ramsar sites and also the low water mark. So those were the marine boundaries used to define the Coastal National Park extent. As an initial step, the report did indicate the potential that might be extended further, but should be perhaps reviewed subsequently. So that was that point, sir. this reference to the use of the word coastal is something that's confusing. Obviously, as a small island, much of the character of which is imbued by the relationship of the land to the coast is one that we think is quite pertinent to the definition of the coastal national park, and is one of the reasons why the recommendation is to include both terrestrial and marine elements to it.
Perhaps you two should have a discussion outside of this forum.
Yeah.
We haven't got time for it now.
There was a comment made about the boundary going through one unit, and clearly there's an ability to make representations to deal with small issues about the precise definition of the boundary as it lands on the ground, and indeed there have been representations made, and the Minister's responded to some of those in his response. Comments made about relabeling, and clearly the Minister's statement response provides a potential option if that's a route that the inspectors wanted to explore further relative to the Minister's option of an Alaska as opposed to an extension to the Coastal National Park. And just lastly, picking up Mrs. Steedman's point about the 2002 island plan, there were a range of designations that existed outside of the built-up area. One of the reasons for seeking to simplify those such that we only had two, which became the green zone and the Coastal National Park, was to provide simplification to the users of the island plan and those that engage through the planning system. So there's a question there as to whether you want to further exacerbate the number of designations. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Mrs. Day, sorry.
Thank you. I just have 2 points to raise, simply because I don't feel like they've been discussed much, and they are of relevance. So the Minister for the Environment does in fact have an interest in gaining access to areas of the Coast National Park. That is out with of the draft plan or any island plan, and that's by way of his countryside access strategy, which is in the public domain. It was published in 2016.
Well, okay, but that's not before us now, is it?
But just to clarify that the Minister does have that, but that's a very positive document where he aims to work with landowners rather than making any impositions. The second thing was mentioned about the sustainability appraisal and what role that has played in our consideration of the extension of the park. So environmental consultants ACOM undertook an independent appraisal that involved a baselining exercise, which they did very early on for us in this process. The summary of the future baseline basically acknowledges everything we've said about incremental change to the landscape and the pressures that are being felt in the most sensitive parts of our island. And then they go on to assess our proposed framework under the landscape, townscape and seascape part of that independent report, and make no recommendations and identify the impact as direct and indirect, long-term, permanent and positive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, thanks very much everyone. We'll take away what you've said and all the representations, as I've already said, and our own site visits into account in all of this, I'm going to thank you for, that's all I'm going to say really. Thanks very much for your contributions. I'm going to take a 5-minute break, and then we've got well, less than that really. As soon as everyone can go, I'm going to go back onto the last part of the agenda, which was the marine environment and one point about the green backdrop zone. So thank you very much everybody. If you're not interested or involved about the marine environment, please go and take your lunch break. Is everyone ready now to continue, please? Sorry, I just need one thing. Where's the... We're continuing the hearing. Hopefully this should not take too long. Please. The question I had was a brief one, but the states have made a response about the creation of a marine park, and there was an amendment proposed, I think, from Senator Farnham, wasn't it? Is he here? Or is anyone speaking for him? No, okay. The issue seemed to be that it was proposed that the national park should be extended to include high-value marine habitats, which would embrace over 900 square kilometres of, or over 30% of Jersey's territorial waters. And I think the plan that was requested, that the plan, it should include something to extend a designation up to 20 metres in depth around Jersey's waters. Now, be careful how I say this. I don't really want to start a war. The state's response sort of quite clearly in their supplementary, well, state's response 53 says that really what is involved with that is actually, renewable, seriously renewable, sort of trying to renew international sea fishing treaties, and we all know what's been going on recently and the difficulties that's involved. So, I mean, I can't really see how this is within the planned process. Is that your take on this?
Apologies, sir, for missing the start of the session. I think our proposal in terms of the creation of or undertaking a marine spatial plan, as it's set out at strategic proposal number 3, is really there to address the challenges of the island faces relative to its marine environment in a comprehensive way.
Yeah.
So I think what we're seeking to do here is to ensure that the plan provides, as I stated earlier, a more sophisticated planning policy regime to manage change in the marine environment, and we listed some of the potential challenges that may emerge over both this plan period and subsequent plan periods, which is why we want to create a more robust planning policy regime for the marine environment. At the moment, we look at issues such as impacts of development on marine biodiversity, and that would be considered under policy NE1. and we've just spent a lot of time talking about impact on landscape, but also seascape character, which would be considered under policy NE3. And then there are also thematic policies relating to those areas that we discussed, like renewable energy and coastal defence. So we're seeking to establish a planning policy regime related to regulation of development activity, but I think as the government we recognise that the island would benefit in having a more comprehensive policy and strategy for management of its marine environment in total, which would include regulation of activities outside of the planning regime and include things like fishing activity, leisure activity, shipping, etc. All of these things at the moment are dealt with in their under their own individual legislative processes,
well, yeah,
but there isn't an overarching plan. So.
Yeah, which is, as I've alluded, way above my pay grade, I think the phrase is, and not what we're here to do within our remit of examining the island plan.
That's right, sir. I think a number of the representations that have been made seek to go beyond what we would define as development activity, and it appears that their primary objective is around the regulation of things like fishing activity, yeah. Which is obviously outside of the planning legislation and is governed by a separate legal framework.
And international agreements, not necessarily legislation.
Right,
but then there's an issue about, Mr. Tudor, you've got your board up. There's an issue about the time frame of this plan. Is that your main concern?
I could make a number of points around timing, the coverage, the scale, if you'd like me to now, sir.
Yeah, okay, but yes, please, yes.
Okay.
In relation, though, to, as were you here right at the start? Right, okay, so you've heard what our task is to do in relation to this land use plan.
Yep.
So keep it restricted to that, please.
Absolutely. So I think there's three key things to highlight. One is timing, as has been said. There's an aspiration, as Kevin has mentioned, to do this at some point. We don't see any reason why not to do it now. The second point really is around fishing, as you mentioned, you've alluded to. Don't want to get into a war.
Well, I didn't mean to be too facetious.
Yeah,
no. What I meant was it's beyond.
But it's a key point because, as Kevin also mentioned there around regulating fishing, none of our submissions and none of the submissions that I've seen have mentioned this around fishing. This has been around inappropriate development and damaging activities, whether they're from leisure, whether they're from offshore wind, whether they're from cabling, it doesn't matter. So that's a very clear point, that a marine park can encompass all damaging activities and inappropriate development. So that's a really key thing to point out as well. The third and final point I want to make is around the extension of the coastal national park. Three options were put forward in the boundary review. The one that's been landed on is the smallest and essentially just covers what's already protected through the Ramsar sites and other MPAs. So the logic is flawed really of why those other options covering the 20-metre contour or all marine habitats of value haven't been considered.
Okay. When you're talking about the question of clarification, other activities, I mean, if they might not be within the planning framework or development, but I suppose, are you thinking of supporting development for those activities around the coast, and that, say, I don't know, a diving school or whatever in a particularly sensitive area should not be allowed, or any building associated with that sort of development? I'm not quite sure what you're really getting at here with this.
So the clarity of the point is that a marine national park or an extension of the coastal national park to cover those areas of high value, marine value, the important thing is that area, as has been talked about earlier this morning, conveys a level of extra protection, a level of protection onto a designation. So whether it's offshore wind or leisure or fishing, it allows the consideration of those activities to be taken in the context of a national park. So whether positive or negative is irrelevant really. The point is that it affords a level of protection, as we've heard all morning, and that level of protection needs to be afforded to the marine environment in a greater scale.
But it's only a level of protection as applies to development as defined in the Planning Act.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So the intention is, as Kevin mentioned, around the marine spatial plan, I'm all for a marine spatial plan. The point is, having a designation like a coastal national park or a marine park allows that to happen, gives it the vision, the visibility that this is an important area, and then all of the planning, all of the zoning, all of the management, all of the enforcement can come later. You know, I can't find an example, or maybe any examples in the world where one has to wait for a gold-plated marine spatial plan before one protects areas of high conservation value for carbon, for fisheries, and for the economy.
So what are you saying the plan should say that it doesn't say at the moment?
It should say that the marine national park or the extension of the coastal national park, the language doesn't matter. I think for the public it does matter, so a marine national park is really key. Can be designated now. All the levers, all the legislation is in place to do that. The island plan is the opportunity and the signal to put it in right now, and everything else can come later.
And what area should that cover?
So it could cover an area of high-value marine habitats. That's the key point, which have been mapped, and all the evidence is there. An alternative is the 20-metre contour. So that gives it, it gives you the ability. You haven't got railways or roads, but you've at least got some lineation. So those are the two options, really. And I think the 20-metre contour includes many of the marine habitats.
If that's below low water mark.
Correct. This is in the sea, essentially, not intertidal.
Yeah, no, I'm just clarifying.
Yeah, sure.
What's the average tidal drop? 12 metres, is it?
Yeah. Pretty big here.
Something like that? Yeah, okay. Thank you, okay. How would you like to respond to that, please? Or would one of your colleagues
I can pick up some of the points and then perhaps ask my colleague to assist on some of the more technical issues. Certainly the timing of the proposal to undertake a marine spatial plan is something that we look to do over the bridging plan period, and my colleague might want to talk about some of the work that's already been undertaken in relation to that. And clearly, as we've sought to set out, we feel that the draft plan provides a greater level of clarity and policy, planning policy cover for development activity in the marine environment that isn't in the current island plan. So we would suggest that the provisions in the plan around protection of biodiversity are there in the draft plan, and likewise the impact of development on landscape and seascape character are also there relative to development activity. But perhaps if I can ask my colleague to talk about some of the other issues raised, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, good morning. Paul Chambers. I work for the Government of Jersey's Marine Resources team. A couple of points to make there. I mean, we're talking about protecting high-value habitats and things, and the suggestion was that they've been mapped and assessed. That's not the case as far as I'm aware of. We are in the process of doing that, certainly as a team, and obviously other people in terms of individual projects and things are doing that. In terms of the sort of protection aspect, the process that we go through as a team does broadly follow the OSPAR Convention's Annex 5 criteria in terms of designating protected areas and protection, which is essentially that you do have to identify the key habitats, and obviously what actually constitutes a key habitat will vary depending on what you consider to be an important function, whether it's biological or other sorts of ecosystem processes that go with it. We generally try and use the OSPAR definitions for key habitats. We went through a process a few years ago of identifying the ones that we were aware of at the time and have put in marine protected areas as a consequence. We are in the second stage of that now, which is part of the Marine Spatial Plan process, which looks at the evidence in terms of what's actually in the sea at the moment, in terms of its environment, its archaeology, its culture, and all the rest of it. We then look at the activities and things that take place across the top of that, whether it's tourism, whether it's industrial, whether it's boating, fishing, whatever it happens to be. And the object of the plan is to be able to provide a management framework that reduces conflict on all scales, so that's between the physical environment and activities that take place, but also between the activities themselves. And we expect that from that will come, the end result of that will be we will have an identification of those habitats that are defined as key, whether it's for biological, carbon sink reasons or whatever it happens to be, and the activities that place there and the recommendations that come with that. We suspect, obviously don't want to prejudice the results from it, will include recommendations to expand some of our marine protected areas. But it's a process that has to be evidence-driven, and it has to take into account the activities and things that go there. And also there is a separate consultation process that will need to go with this, because obviously when you actually start putting in layers of protection, you're affecting people's ability to do things and potentially some economic activities and things as well. So it is a process that has begun. It will be, I suspect, more formalised in this sort of marine spatial plan, the scoping for which has been undertaken already but was interrupted due to COVID and other bits and pieces. And certainly from my team's point of view, that's the way to go.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yep.
You can come back, Phil. But that's not. That's not under your Jersey planning legislation, is it?
It is a plan, and so it actually cuts across quite a range of activities, because we have harbours regulations, fisheries regulations.
Your powers to do this under your legislative framework. I'm free to admit I'm not an expert in marine planning, and you know that's not. I don't think. Hope we don't need to be to talk about this. I mean, I'm just trying to establish what in terms of the planning framework and the plan. The plan is just referring to this and saying that other government agencies in Jersey are going to do this, and it's supported, you know, as a sort of an intention, but it's not within the planning framework that I have to deal
Correct.
with.
And that's, I think, one of
It's
the points we're
outside
making.
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's really what the sort of key point I needed to clarify for our report. I mean, I'm not saying in any way that it's inappropriate that you're doing this, but it's just not anything that I can particularly comment on. And you're really wanting a change in the reference in the plan to this, to say it should be brought forward more quickly.
Yes, absolutely. I think the point is that an extension of the Coastal National Park, as referenced in the boundary review, it enables this to happen already. So yes, and I all due respect, and I respect Paul's words there. You know, page 105, the figure NE3 shows the high-value habitats. Yes, you can go out and survey more and get them more precise, but the evidence is there to designate now. More information can come on exactly where pinpointing them, exactly which activities, exactly when the planning starts, exactly when the enforcement starts. But the point is, it sets a marker to say these are important to the country of Jersey. And the point is, if we wait 3 years until the marine spatial plan is complete, and then a level of discussion after that, those habitats may be gone.
Well, okay, what's your response to that as far as the planning framework is concerned? Can you do that?
Can we do
what Mr. Tudor's asked, to designate an area for the plan?
Well, clearly it remains within the gift of the State Assembly to determine the boundaries that it wants to use for the Coastal National Park, if that's the mechanism that you're asking about,
right,
sir.
Okay, so is that what you're asking for?
My point is...
extension to the Coast National Park?
Well, very, very clearly, I mean, whether we call it a marine national park, which helps the public, or whether it's an extension of the Coastal National Park, the point is those areas can be covered now. Because the Coastal National Park, the criteria that's been chosen has to cover the current existing areas, the Ramsar sites and the existing MPAs. There's a choice to be made to make that into other areas, to the 20-metre contour, to the high value. It's a choice. And the choice can be made, I think, as Kevin has alluded to.
For control. Well, okay, so I think you've already answered that, I think, haven't you?
I think that's right, sir. The decision that's been made at the moment is that the proposal is to limit it to the low water mark and to Ramsar sites, but that doesn't preclude regulating the effect of development activity on marine biodiversity outside of those designated areas. So policy NE1 is at large, sir, and would be a material consideration in relation to any development activity right out to the island's territorial limits. So from a planning point of view, we have a planning policy regime which is set out in the plan, and we would consider both the impact of development proposals on marine biodiversity, and there'd be a requirement on any applicant to provide us with sufficient evidence about the impact of that proposal on marine biodiversity under policy NE1, and likewise they'd also be required to demonstrate the impact of that development activity in terms of its effect on seascape character under policy NE3, notwithstanding the fact that it was either in or outside of the coastal national park boundaries.
Yes.
Just to respond to that, so
last response.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you wanted to drill into the pavement outside, you need permission. But if you want to do it in a national park, it affords a higher level of protection. So yes, if you want to do something in the sea today, it needs to go through the planning process. However, designating a marine park is a signal and raises the level of protection.
Well, okay, Mr. Morrell, do you want to?
Well, in same response to that, then, what's the point of a national park if it does nothing then? Well, we might as well.
It's nice to have some agreement at least today. Well, anyway.
Well, actually, I'm going to make the same points I made earlier with the Coastal National Park. The issue we have here is the use of the term park. I am absolutely in favour of extending protection against development in the marine areas that have been designated. But until, as you have suggested, with regard to fisheries activities, regulation around those sorts of areas, which are incredibly inflammatory and difficult and need to be treaded a delicate path, so to speak, I firmly believe that in terms of the island plan, any areas that we are looking at as planning areas against development need to just be called that. This should be a marine development protection area, or whatever you want, but calling it a park raises many different issues. We have a parks law in Jersey. It doesn't relate to the coastal national park planning area. It doesn't relate to a marine park area either. And so I think it's really important we get the terminology right here. I'm more than happy to support your proposition in terms of against development in that area, but not to take it to the level of a park yet until we have all the other things such as fisheries and other very technical matters worked out. And only then, when it is actually a park, should we do that.
Well, I don't think terminology should trip us up, frankly. And the other point is, how long do we wait?
Well, I've got that. Mr. Aluto, would you like to comment on this, please?
Yeah, I think that we're confused as to the logic of the Minister and the logic of the department, and that there was 3 options provided on page 41 of the Jersey Coastal National Park Boundary Review. Those options: Ramsar site boundaries, high biodiversity, 20-metre depth contour. Now, the Minister is obliged under the Planning Law 2002 to enhance, protect, conserve biodiversity, and yet he has chosen to go for option A, ignoring option B. And you just think, well, where's the logic there? If the Minister is obliged to deliver a island plan which protects, conserves and enhances biodiversity, why then, when you're going to extend your national park, go for option A, which excludes high biodiversity? So, and we raised this actually during the consultation period before this and said we don't understand the logic here. And what came back was, well, we don't want to get confused with fisheries. We said, well, it's nothing to do with fisheries. This is an island plan issue. And actually, if you look at the reasons why, it's just the disadvantage of not choosing option B is there was a potential risk the coastal national park could be assumed to be related to fishing regulation, which is not the case. Well, that may be an issue, but that's nothing to do with the planning process which we're looking at today. Fishing regulation is not part of it. So why on earth is it seen as a disadvantage to the Minister actually accepting option B? And in my view, the Minister's actually using fishing regulation as an excuse not to adopt option B, and I don't think that's appropriate, because he should be solely focusing on planning issues and not issues outside of the planning process. And that would be our perspective.
Okay. Yes, Mrs. Day.
Thank you. I thought it would be helpful to be clear that the consideration of impact on development impact on our marine environment isn't without statutory basis. So we do have the Planning and Building Environmental Impact Jersey Order 2006, which exists to, as Mr. Luto has explained, to to ensure that the Minister is able to meet the requirements of the law. So under Schedule 1, 12. Other projects, it's very clear that that order extends to development of land covered by sea. So typically that benchmark threshold is at mean high water mark, So all development that takes place in the marine environment in Jersey out to the territorial extent has to be accompanied by an environmental impact assessment. Now, there is an extensive consultation process that goes with that, to which all those people who would be aware of the environmental issues and any data that might exist will have opportunity to comment on that environmental impact assessment. So I just wanted to be clear that the consideration of environmental impact of the marine environment is not without a statutory basis. It is, and it is considered as part of planning application.
Okay, well, I've got that, but has that answered the point from Mr. Aluto's point about
just the response to that, sir? I think, as I tried to say earlier on, the plan provides a policy regime related to the protection of biodiversity, whether that's terrestrial or marine, and that's provided by policy NE1. So that would be a material consideration for any development that affects the marine biodiversity, sir.
Mr. Tudor,
So,
do you want to comment on that?
well, I think we're slightly running circles, aren't we? I think,
We are, but I'm
that,
going to stop it soon.
Mr. Luca said really is that the options that have gone through the boundary review, the logic doesn't flow, I'm afraid. And also, as I said earlier, damaging activities, inappropriate development is what we've said in our responses to all of this and our further representations. We haven't mentioned fishing. Fishing is an issue, but so is wind farm development, so is cabling, so is leisure, everything. Inappropriate development is what we're focusing on. And I think it's got conflated with other issues that are political.
Okay, yes, Société Jersaise. Mr. Pinel, isn't it?
The Société would concur with the Blue Marine Foundation's approach about implementing a marine protection zone now, rather than waiting for clarification at some distant point in the future when we have better information to do that. I think the approach that the Blue Marine Foundation has taken is very sensible.
Yeah, you need to have the microphone on. Sorry, microphone.
The government have submitted...
Just say that again, because it won't be recorded on the live
The
stream.
Société concur with the Blue Marine Foundation's approach to implementing a marine designation now, rather than waiting for the proposed policy regime, which we don't have a timescale for, and it is a failing of parts of the Bridging Island Plan, as it does rely heavily on supplementary planning guidance and other policy which currently doesn't exist. The government proposed that the designation of a marine park should wait until we have better data about the location and condition of the quality habitat types that we want to propose. But the existing marine protected areas that we have are obviously just straight lines across the sea, which take in no regard to the extent of habitats. The approach for designating our current coastal national park, again, doesn't take in account of any ecosystem approach to designating a boundary. So I think it's misleading to say that we have to wait for better information before we can appropriately map an area that is deserving of protection. Following something like the 20-metre contour sounds absolutely perfect to me, and again it's kind of the approach we've taken on land by just picking useful roads to use those as boundaries in a relatively meaningless context. When I say is, if it's an approach to protect biodiversity, you do need to take into account the extent of those habitats. If it's a designation, which is potentially a heavy-handed approach to conserving areas, it doesn't mean it's a bad approach, because at least you encompass the best, perhaps parts of the worst, but the idea is to protect those best. The question that's been proposed here is does the Bridging Island Plan provide an adequate approach to the conservation and development of marine areas? And we think it doesn't, because it significantly lacks extensive marine protected areas, and SP5, NE1 and NE3 are they're really policies designed to protect the terrestrial landscape. The marine and the terrestrial environments are very different approaches to nature conservation, but they're also tend to be protected site-based approaches to conservation and landscape scale approaches to conservation, rather than drilling down to the conservation of the biodiversity within those areas. With that lack of regard to biodiversity protection, it is addressed, obviously, but I think not in the same way that landscape issues and the protection of designated sites is addressed. And in the absence of designated sites in the marine environment, it cannot be adequately protected in the absence of marine protected areas.
Well, so what are you saying the plan should say?
So the plan should embrace this idea of designating...
It should designate a marine
protected
area. A whole
area.
new thing that hasn't been consulted on.
No, but it doesn't have to be... You can call it anything you like. And it's a national park extension, like we spoke about earlier. The national park could be extended below mean low water. It could go to whatever limits the Minister wished it to, and it makes complete sense to me that it would include those areas of marine park that would benefit from that sort of protection.
But would cover the... Okay. Anything else to say on this?
Could I just say one more thing? Because I did think we'd go through questions number 1, 2, 3, 4. So I did fail to mention our view on the proposal to designate the Alaska.
Well, come on, no, this is just... I'm not going to... I've got your written representations on it. Everyone's gone. You should have said so at the time.
Sir, you posed these questions. I assumed you'd go through them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You choose to ignore questions 2 and 3. So I just want to say, in terms of the Alaska, we think it would confuse the issue. We think it's very important to stick to a national park designation, and we also think that that national park designation should be extended
that point's been made by
to
other
the marine
people.
Environment.
That point's been made by other people.
Well, we'd just like to...
well, I knew it anyway, but it's been made by other people. I tried to cover those questions in the discussion all the way in the way that I dealt with it, and everyone had plenty of time to do it, and you had plenty of time to refer to it during that discussion. I've lost where... Well, okay, I'm not sure. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about this marine designated area?
Just to pick up a couple of points that Mr Pinner raised. Firstly, he indicated there was a lack of a timescale in the Minister's response to the amendment that's been lodged in relation to this matter. So that's set out in his statement response number 53.
Yeah.
The Minister would be minded to accept the
yes, I've seen
change
okay.
on the timescale. And it's just really picking up on the point that we made before, so you don't need a designated site to necessarily ensure that impact on marine biodiversity and seascape is a material consideration, either through the planning policy, any one and any 3, or through the EIA procedure. So.
Right, okay. Mr Tudor?
So just
what new point do you want to make?
Yes, 2 new points on that. So the timescale that's been committed to is for a marine spatial plan, not for designation of any extra protection.
Right,
just be clear on that. And the other point is around the powers exist to extend the national park. Whether you call it a marine national park, a marine park, an extended coastal national park, it can be done now. It's not new. It's not new. It can be done.
Well,
the extension of the national park into the sea is happening. As option A, as Charles said, there's an option B and an option C, and the logic for refusal of those isn't correct.
Well, okay, I've got the point about that, and we could comment about that, but procedurally, I'm just thinking what would have to happen procedurally, but let's just leave it. Right, okay, Mrs. Stephen, what's...
Sorry, sir, that's incorrect.
All right, Mr. McCarthy, you weren't supposed to be here. Well, I'm just... No, I mean, why you're coming to the plenary. It's not really acceptable for you to just turn up at the table and start speaking.
Well, I feel that there's something that you did ask that if there wasn't something you hadn't previously covered, you should cover it. And I'm talking about the outcome of COP26.
Okay, well you can, look, no, I'm not going to allow it because we've gone too long and it's a new thing that you're just bringing up. You can come to the plenary and address us on it there. Okay. We've still got one other matter to do, but which was the green backdrop zone. Was that you, Ms. Scott?
Yes, I have the green backdrop zone is relevant to my area.
I mean, I know what you've said about it. We've looked at the green backdrop zone. Just try and you want me to add something into St Bernard's Bay, is that correct?
Well, sir, I was just looking at the question that you've raised. And in a sense, you're saying, is the green backdrop zone appropriately drawn?
Well, someone, I think, raised the point that it wasn't appropriately drawn, and it seemed to cover the natural environment as much as anything else, because that's what's trying to be protected there as a backdrop for development. We're talking about St Brelade's Bay under, EV1. Sorry? Yes, Mrs. Stephen.
Thank you, sir. It's a representation on behalf of a client. They have a garden that is adjacent to the green backdrop zone, and the character would not be affected at all by designating the garden as green backdrop zone, and they were just wondering why that, because the implications are if you're in the green zone, as we've talked around this morning, it's very difficult to achieve development, and they would like more flexibility to have the area within their garden designated as green backdrop zone. That is just one example, sir.
Okay. Can we leave it there, please?
Well, can I just respond to that, please? Basically, we have got this issue of there's a St Brelade's Bay character appraisal that has been funded at public expense, and which does set out specific character areas for St Brelade's Bay, and it would be, I think, at least appropriate to see some sort of consistency in terms of the way in which they are designated in terms of planning zones. We also did suggest an amendment to the shoreline, to the green backdrop zone, which the minister has responded by suggesting an amendment to GD9. We can come back to that with the general policy, sir.
All right, that's just about, you've beaten me to it. We're talking about general development policies in the afternoon of Monday week,
Sure.
And I'll take that on there. Okay, whether I add it formally, just take it, I will deal with it there. I think you're coming to that, aren't you? Okay, is there anything you wanted to say in conclusion before
I think we've issued our response to all of those issues, sir.
Okay, right. Thanks very much, everyone. Session's closed. Thank you.